The war in the Pacific did not turn on a battlefield. It turned on a map spread across a quiet room, where distance mattered more than noise. While headlines followed explosions and landings, Chester W. Nimitz fought a different kind of war. A war of oceans measured in thousands of miles. A war where time, logistics, and restraint could decide outcomes long before the first shot was fired. He did not command by presence or spectacle. He commanded by balance, knowing when to strike, when to wait, and when patience would save more lives than speed ever could. Nimitz inherited disaster. After Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy was wounded, scattered, and uncertain. Battleships lay sunk. Morale was shaken. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, and the enemy seemed to move faster than response could form. There was no manual for how to fight a naval war on this scale, only fragments of doctrine and the weight of responsibility. Nimitz did not panic. He assessed. He understood that the Pacific was not a place for emotion. It was a place for calculation. Every carrier mattered. Every pilot mattered. Every decision echoed across weeks of sailing and months of supply. His strength was not aggression, it was judgment. At Midway, that judgment would define the war. With incomplete information and everything at risk, Nimitz committed his remaining carriers not because victory was guaranteed, but because delay would be fatal. The result reshaped naval warfare and permanently shifted momentum in the Pacific, not through overwhelming force, but through timing and trust in preparation. From that moment forward, Nimitz directed a campaign of pressure rather than spectacle, island by island, sea lane by sea lane, always forward but never careless. He balanced competing commanders, strong personalities, and clashing strategies. He coordinated joint operations across vast distances, where miscommunication could mean catastrophe. And he did so without seeking the spotlight, allowing results to speak where rhetoric was unnecessary. Nimitz understood something essential. Wars are not won by brilliance alone. They are won by sustainability. He built a war effort that could endure, rotating forces, protecting supply lines, preserving experience, and choosing objectives that mattered not just today, but months ahead. Under his leadership, the Pacific Campaign became a tightening arc rather than a reckless charge. When the war finally ended, Nimitz stood not as a conqueror, but as a steward. On the deck of the USS Missouri, as surrender was signed, he represented a war fought across oceans, airspace, and time itself. The victory was vast, the cost was immeasurable, and the calm with which it was concluded reflected the man who had guided it. The history of Chester Nimitz is not a story of dramatic speeches or singular moments of fury. It is a story of restraint under pressure, of leadership without ego, of decisions made quietly and lived with forever. He reminds us that some of the most important victories are won far from the front line, by those who understand that power must be paced if it is to last. Tonight, we return to that quiet command, to the maps and radios, to the carriers moving across open water, to the Admiral who understood that the Pacific War would be decided not by who shouted loudest, but by who endured longest. This is the history of Admiral Chester Nimitz. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it for you there? Is this part of a late-night unwind, an early morning listen, or a rare quiet moment carved out of a busy day? And if these long, steady journeys through history help you slow down, think clearly, or feel grounded, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Every subscription helps keep this space alive for calm, in-depth storytelling that values patience over noise. If this feels like a place you'd like to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of Chester Nimitz, Fredericksburg, Texas. The year is 1900. A 15-year-old boy sits in his grandfather's hotel, surrounded by maps of the world's oceans. Chester William Nimitz has just received news that will change his life, though not in the way he expected. His congressman has no appointments available to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Instead, there's an opening at a place most Texans have never heard of, the Naval Academy at Annapolis. The boy who wanted to be a soldier will become a sailor. The man who couldn't get into West Point will one day command the largest naval force in human history. Chester Nimitz grew up in a landlocked town 300 miles from the nearest ocean, yet the sea was always present in his childhood. His grandfather, Charles Henry Nimitz, was a German immigrant who had served in the merchant marine before settling in the Texas Hill Country. The old man filled young Chester's imagination with stories of storms in the North Atlantic, of navigation by the stars, of ports in Asia and Africa. When Chester's father died before he was born, his grandfather became his surrogate parent and his window to a world beyond Texas. The hotel the family ran was filled with sailors' tales and maritime artifacts. By the time Chester was old enough to understand, he already knew that life happened on the water, not the land. When the letter came from his congressman offering Annapolis instead of West Point, Chester accepted immediately. He was going to sea. September 1889, Annapolis, Maryland. Nimitz arrived at the Naval Academy as one of 114 plebes in his class. He was not the most naturally gifted student, not the most athletic, not the most socially connected, but he possessed something that would define his entire career, an ability to learn from failure without being destroyed by it. He studied engineering and navigation with methodical intensity. He observed how the best officers balanced technical knowledge with leadership. He graduated 7th in his class, high enough to prove his competence, low enough to avoid the arrogance that often accompanied top rankings. In January 1905, Ensign Nimitz received his first assignment, the battleship USS Ohio, stationed in the Far East. He was 20 years old and had never commanded anything larger than a rowboat. Then came the disaster that should have ended his career before it began. July 7, 1907. The Philippine Islands. Nimitz had been promoted to command of the destroyer USS Decatur, making him one of the youngest commanding officers in the Navy. He was navigating the ship through Batangas Bay when he misread the water depth. The Decatur ran aground on a mudbank at 8 knots. The ship stuck fast. The engines strained uselessly. Within hours, the entire Asiatic fleet knew that Ensign Nimitz had run his first command aground like a novice. A court-martial was convened. Nimitz stood before a panel of senior officers and accepted full responsibility. He offered no excuses, blamed no subordinates, made no appeals for sympathy. The court found him guilty of hazarding his vessel through neglect. His punishment was a letter of reprimand. It was remarkably lenient, and Nimitz never forgot it. Mercy had been extended to him at his lowest moment. That act of institutional grace would shape how he treated subordinates for the next 4 decades. Most officers would have played it safe after such a humiliation, seeking comfortable staff positions and avoiding risk. Nimitz did the opposite. In 1909, he volunteered for the Navy's submarine service when submarines were considered experimental death traps. The vessels were primitive, dangerous, and deeply unglamorous. Most of the Navy's elite regarded submarine duty as career suicide, but Nimitz saw opportunity where others saw danger. He became commander of the Atlantic submarine flotilla, learning the strange new world of undersea warfare. He mastered the technical challenges of diesel engines, ballast control, and submerged navigation. More importantly, he learned to think unconventionally, to see warfare from perspectives that surface sailors never considered. While his academy classmates were serving on battleships and cruisers, pursuing traditional paths to flag rank, Nimitz was experimenting with a weapon that most admirals dismissed as a curious toy. His technical brilliance emerged during this period in ways that transcended military applications. By 1912, Nimitz had become so expert in diesel engine design that he developed his own improvements to the technology. He submitted a patent application for a new diesel engine modification that improved fuel efficiency and reduced mechanical failure. The United States Patent Office granted him patent number 1150560 in 1915. The design was adopted not just by the Navy, but by commercial shipping companies. Here was a naval officer who didn't just follow doctrine, he improved the machines themselves. This combination of practical engineering skill and creative problem-solving would prove invaluable 3 decades later, when America needed to outbuild and outthink an enemy across 5,000 miles of ocean. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Nimitz built a reputation as a staff officer of unusual competence. He wasn't a dashing combat commander like some of his contemporaries. He didn't have the charisma of Douglas MacArthur or the aggressive reputation of William Halsey. What he possessed was judgment. He served at the Naval War College, where he studied Japanese naval doctrine and war-game Pacific campaigns. He commanded cruisers and battleships, learning the rhythms of surface warfare. He served in the Bureau of Navigation, the Navy's personnel office, where he came to know the strengths and weaknesses of virtually every senior officer in the fleet. This last assignment seemed like a career dead end to outside observers, a desk job for an officer being put out to pasture, but it gave Nimitz something more valuable than glory. He knew his people. By 1941, Nimitz was 56 years old and seemed destined to retire as a respected but not particularly famous rear admiral. He held the position of Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, essentially the Navy's Human Resources Director. It was an important job, but hardly a path to historical significance. The real action in the Pacific belonged to younger men, like Admiral Husband Kimmel, who commanded the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor. Nimitz worked in Washington, managing personnel files and assignment rotations. When war came, and everyone knew it was coming, he expected to watch it from behind a desk. The Navy had built its entire Pacific strategy around battleships and the decisive surface engagement. Nimitz's expertise in submarines and personnel management seemed unlikely to matter in the climactic struggle everyone anticipated. History, it appeared, would pass him by. Then, December 7th, 1941, arrived and everything changed. Nimitz was at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington that Sunday afternoon when the first radio reports crackled through. Pearl Harbor was under attack. The Pacific Fleet was burning. The battleship navy that America had spent 2 decades building was being destroyed in a single morning. By evening, the casualty reports were staggering. Thousands dead, 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. Admiral Kimmel would have to be relieved. Someone would have to take command of the shattered Pacific Fleet. Secretary of the Navy. Frank Knox summoned Nimitz to his office on December 8th. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. Knox told him that President Roosevelt wanted him to assume command of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz protested that 28 admirals were senior to him. Knox said the president didn't care. Nimitz asked what his mission was. Knox gave him 3 words: win the war. Christmas Day, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Oahu. Nimitz arrived by flying boat to take command of his new fleet. What he saw was worse than the reports suggested. The battleship Arizona was still burning, 3 weeks after the attack. Oil slicks covered the harbor surface. Capsized holes jutted from the water like the ribs of dead leviathans. The surviving sailors looked shell-shocked, moving through their duties with the mechanical emptiness of defeated men. Nimitz walked through the destruction in silence, absorbing the scale of the catastrophe. But he also noticed something else, something the newspaper reports and official communications had buried beneath the horror. All 3 of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack. They survived. The battleship navy was gone, but the carrier force remained. The Japanese had destroyed the old navy. They had inadvertently given Nimitz the tools to invent a new one. The man who couldn't get into West Point, who had run his first ship aground, who had spent years in submarines and personnel offices far from glory, was about to revolutionize naval warfare. His education in failure and unconventional thinking was complete. Now came the test. Washington, D.C., February 6, 1922. In an ornate hall filled with diplomats from 9 nations, the United States signed a treaty that its military leaders believed would prevent the next World War. The Washington Naval Treaty set strict limits on battleship construction. America and Britain could each build 525,000 tons of battleships. Japan, 315,000 tons. The ratios were designed to maintain peace through balance. American admirals walked out of the conference convinced they had achieved strategic stability in the Pacific. They were wrong. The treaty didn't prevent war. It simply determined which ships would fight it, and the Americans had bet everything on the wrong type of vessel. The battleship was more than just a weapon in the interwar U.S. Navy. It was a religion. The entire officer corps had been raised on the teachings of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the naval theorist who argued that wars at sea were decided by great fleet engagements between heavy ships. Mahan's disciples studied the Battle of Jutland, where British and German dreadnoughts had clashed in the North Sea during World War I. They believed the coming Pacific War would be decided the same way, two battle lines closing to within 20,000 yards, trading salvos of 16-inch shells until one fleet was destroyed. Every war game at the Naval War College, every fleet exercise off California, every promotion board decision reinforced this assumption. The man who commanded battleships rose to command the fleet. The man who understood surface gunnery became an admiral. The Navy built its entire strategic doctrine around a decisive engagement that would never happen. War Plan Orange embodied this battleship mythology. Developed throughout the 1920s and 30s, it was the Navy's blueprint for war against Japan. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophically wrong in its assumptions. When war began, the American battle fleet would steam west from Hawaii toward the Philippines. The Japanese fleet would sortie to meet them. Somewhere near the Philippine Islands, the two fleets would engage in a Jutland-style surface action. American 16-inch guns would outrange and outfight Japanese 14-inch guns. The Imperial Navy would be destroyed in an afternoon. With control of the seas secured, American forces would advance island by island across the Pacific until Japan surrendered. It was logical, methodical, and based on every naval battle of the previous 3 centuries. It was also completely divorced from the reality of modern naval warfare. While American admirals built battleships and planned for Jutland in the Pacific, Japanese strategists were learning different lessons. They watched as aviation technology advanced throughout the 20s and 30s. They observed British carrier operations in the Mediterranean. They studied the increasing range and payload capacity of carrier aircraft. And they drew a revolutionary conclusion. The aircraft carrier, not the battleship, would dominate the next naval war. By 1941, Japan had 10 aircraft carriers in service. America had 7 in the entire Navy, only 3 assigned to the Pacific. Japanese pilots trained relentlessly in torpedo and dive-bombing techniques. American carrier doctrine was still primitive, viewing carriers primarily as scouts for the battle fleet. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned the Pearl Harbor attack, he designed it around carrier aviation because he understood what American admirals refused to accept. The battleship era was over before the war began. The man responsible for strategic planning in Washington during this period was Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations. Stark was intelligent, experienced, and utterly convinced that War Plan Orange was sound. He positioned the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1940, moving it from San Diego over the protests of several senior officers. The logic was straightforward. Pearl Harbor was closer to Japan, allowing faster response to Japanese aggression, but it also concentrated nearly the entire battle fleet in a single exposed location. Admiral James Richardson, commander of the Pacific Fleet, protested so vigorously that Roosevelt relieved him of command. Richardson argued that Pearl Harbor's shallow depth and confined waters made it vulnerable to air attack. He was replaced by Admiral Husband Kimmel, who accepted the positioning without complaint. By late 1941, America's entire battleship striking force sat anchored in a harbor 9 rows deep, perfect targets for an attack that War Plan Orange insisted would never come. The Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, was where officers learned to think strategically about the coming conflict. Year after year, students played war games that simulated the Pacific Campaign. The games always followed the same pattern: Japanese surprise attack somewhere in the Western Pacific, American battle fleet sortie, decisive engagement near the Philippines, American victory. The games never seriously considered sustained carrier operations. They never simulated prolonged submarine campaigns against merchant shipping. They never explored amphibious assaults against fortified islands. When innovative officers suggested alternative scenarios, they were gently redirected back to orthodox thinking. Captain Ernest King, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, was one of the few senior officers who advocated for carrier warfare in the 1930s. He was considered a brilliant eccentric. His ideas were noted and then filed away. The battleship admirals controlled promotions, and they promoted men who shared their convictions. Aviation in the interwar Navy existed in a strange twilight status, acknowledged as important but never quite accepted as central. Naval aviators wore gold wings on their uniforms, but were often excluded from the highest commands. To become an admiral, you commanded battleships, not carriers. The Navy built carriers throughout the 1930s. Lexington and Saratoga converted from battlecruiser hulls, Ranger and Wasp, purpose-built, but treated them as supporting units rather than capital ships. Carrier doctrine emphasized scouting for the battle fleet and attacking enemy carriers to clear the way for battleship engagement. The idea that carriers could independently strike land targets hundreds of miles from the battle fleet was considered theoretically interesting, but tactically unsound. When Lexington and Saratoga conducted exercises in the 1930s that demonstrated carriers could attack Pearl Harbor successfully, the results were dismissed as unrealistic. The umpires ruled that such an attack would be suicidal in wartime. No enemy would risk their carriers so recklessly. By the summer of 1941, the disparity between American doctrine and Pacific reality had become a chasm. Japan possessed not just more carriers, but better carrier doctrine, better trained pilots, and better understanding of how to use aviation at sea. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber and IHED-3A dive bomber were purpose-built for carrier operations and far superior to their American counterparts. Japanese pilots trained in large-scale carrier operations, practicing coordinated strikes by hundreds of aircraft. American carrier pilots were skilled individually, but had never worked together in mass formations. Japanese naval aviation emphasized offensive action at maximum range. American doctrine still focused on defending the battle fleet. The technological and doctrinal gap wasn't insurmountable, but it would take years of bloody learning to close. Pearl Harbor would eliminate the battleship fleet that American strategy depended on. The war would have to be won by carriers using tactics that hadn't been invented yet. In Washington, Chester Nimitz observed these strategic debates from his position at the Bureau of Navigation. He was not a battleship admiral, not a carrier admiral, not a member of any of the doctrinal factions fighting for dominance. His expertise in submarines and his experience in personnel management kept him outside the main currents of naval politics. But this outsider status gave him perspective. He had studied Japanese capabilities during his war college tenure. He understood that the Pacific's vast distances would make logistics as important as tactics. He recognized that the Navy's personnel system promoted conformity over innovation. And he knew something else, something he rarely spoke about. War Plan Orange was a beautiful theory, disconnected from brutal reality. When the call came in December 1941 to take command of the Pacific Fleet, Nimitz was one of the few senior officers who understood that the old Navy was gone and a new Navy would have to be invented. The battleships were at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The war would be fought with weapons and doctrines that didn't yet exist. And the man who had spent his career outside the mainstream of naval thinking was now responsible for reimagining everything. The tragedy of the interwar period wasn't that America built battleships. Every Navy did. The tragedy was intellectual rigidity, the inability to question fundamental assumptions, even as technology rendered them obsolete. Officers who had spent 30 years preparing for Jutland in the Pacific couldn't accept that their life's work was based on a false premise. The Navy had chosen its weapons, designed its strategy, and positioned its fleet according to a theory of warfare that aircraft carriers had already made obsolete. Pearl Harbor would destroy the ships. The first year of the war would destroy the doctrine. And from those ashes, Nimitz would build something entirely new. But first, he had to survive the disaster that everyone should have seen coming. Washington, D.C., December 7th, 1941. 1:47 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz is having lunch at the Mayflower Hotel when the concierge approaches his table. "There's an urgent radio bulletin, sir. Pearl Harbor is under attack." Nimitz excuses himself and walks quickly to the hotel lobby where a crowd has gathered around the radio. The announcer's voice is shaking as he reads the Associated Press wire. "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air," President Roosevelt has announced. The lobby erupts in gasps and shouted questions. Nimitz stands silently, his face betraying nothing. His wife later says he went completely still, the way a man does when absorbing a blow. In his mind, he is already calculating distances, fuel requirements, carrier positions. The war everyone knew was coming has arrived. And somewhere in the Pacific, the Navy he has served for 36 years is burning. The next 72 hours blur into a cascade of fragmentary reports and horrifying revelations. December 8th, Secretary of the Navy. Frank Knox briefs senior officers on the damage. 8 battleships hit. Arizona destroyed with over 1,000 men trapped inside. Oklahoma capsized. West Virginia sunk at her moorings. California settling into the mud. The casualty estimates climbed throughout the day. 500 dead, then 1,000, then 1,500, finally settling at 2,403. Nearly 1,200 more wounded. 188 aircraft destroyed, most on the ground. The Pacific Fleet has lost its striking force in less than 2 hours. December 9th, reports arrive of Japanese attacks throughout the Pacific. Wake Island under siege, Guam fallen, the Philippines being invaded. Hong Kong surrounded. The disaster is not isolated, it's coordinated. Japan isn't raiding American territories. Japan is conquering the Western Pacific. December 10th, the British battleship. Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse are sunk by Japanese aircraft off Malaya. The Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet, which was supposed to reinforce the Pacific, no longer exists as a fighting force. America and Britain have lost naval supremacy in the Pacific in 3 days. In the Navy Department building on Constitution Avenue, the mood veers between rage and despair. Officers demand immediate counterattacks. They want to sortie the surviving carriers against the Japanese homeland. They want revenge for Pearl Harbor. Others counsel caution, arguing that hasty action will lead to more disasters. Admiral Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, looks 10 years older than he did a week ago. Admiral Ernest King, commander of the Atlantic Fleet, is summoned to Washington for consultations. The question nobody wants to ask aloud hangs over every meeting. How did this happen? How did the Navy fail so catastrophically to anticipate and defend against the attack? Someone will have to be held accountable. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, commander of Army forces in Hawaii, are the obvious scapegoats. But accountability won't rebuild the fleet. Someone needs to take command in the Pacific. Someone needs to salvage a campaign that hasn't even begun yet. December 16th. The White House. President Franklin Roosevelt summons Chester Nimitz to a private meeting. Secretary Knox is present, as is Admiral Stark. Roosevelt gets directly to the point. He's relieving Kimmel and Short. He's creating a new command structure in the Pacific, and he's offering Nimitz command of the Pacific Fleet with the rank of Admiral. Nimitz is stunned. There are 28 flag officers senior to him. Any of them could claim precedent for the position. Roosevelt waves away the objection. "I have confidence in you," the president says. "The job is yours if you want it." Nimitz doesn't hesitate. "I accept, Mr. President." Roosevelt leans back in his wheelchair and studies the man he's just promoted over dozens of more senior officers. "Tell me, Admiral, what will you need to win this war?" Nimitz considers for a moment, then gives the answer that will define his entire Pacific campaign. "Time, Mr. President, just time." The promotion creates immediate controversy within the Navy. Flag officers who have spent decades working toward Pacific Fleet Command are furious at being passed over. Some threaten to resign, others begin political maneuvering to undermine the appointment. But Roosevelt and Knox are adamant. They've chosen Nimitz for specific reasons. First, he's not tainted by the Pearl Harbor disaster. Second, he has a reputation for steady judgment rather than reckless aggression. Third, his work in the Bureau of Navigation means he knows the officer corps better than anyone. Fourth, and perhaps most important, he's not a battleship admiral. His background in submarines and staff work means he's not emotionally invested in the doctrine that just failed catastrophically. The Navy needs someone who can think differently. Nimitz, the officer who couldn't get into West Point, who ran his first ship aground, who spent years in unglamorous assignments, has become the man Roosevelt believes can win the Pacific War. Nimitz spends the next week in Washington, preparing for the journey west. He receives classified briefings on the full extent of the Pearl Harbor disaster, information far worse than the public knows. He learns that the Navy's intelligence officers had detected unusual Japanese communications traffic in the weeks before the attack, but failed to interpret it correctly. He reads estimates of how long it will take to rebuild the battle fleet. 2 years minimum, possibly 4. He reviews War Plan Orange and concludes it's useless. The plan assumed a battle fleet that no longer exists. He meets with his designated subordinates and begins assembling his staff. Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser commander with a reputation for cold analytical thinking. Admiral William Halsey, a carrier task force commander known for aggressive action. Admiral Robert Gormley, who will command the South Pacific area. These are the men who will help him reinvent naval warfare, if they survive the first 6 months. December 24th, Union Station, Washington. Nimitz boards the train that will carry him to San Francisco, where he'll fly to Pearl Harbor. He carries a single briefcase containing intelligence reports, command directives, and his handwritten notes on Pacific strategy. Catherine Nimitz, his wife of 27 years, stands on the platform. They embrace briefly. He tells her he doesn't know when he'll be back. She tells him she believes in him. The train pulls away. Nimitz sits in his private compartment and opens the briefcase. Inside is a folder marked Most Secret. It contains the latest intelligence assessment of Japanese capabilities. They have 10 fleet carriers. We have 3 in the Pacific. They have 500,000 trained troops positioned across the Western Pacific. We have garrison forces scattered on isolated islands. They have the initiative. We have burning ships. Nimitz closes the folder and stares out the window at the passing Virginia countryside. In 5 days, he will take command of a fleet that has just suffered the worst defeat in American naval history. He is 56 years old. He has never commanded carriers in combat. The mission is to somehow cross 5,000 miles of ocean and defeat an enemy that currently controls the entire Western Pacific. The president's words echo in his mind. Win the war. Christmas Day, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The flying boat carrying Nimitz touches down in the harbor at 10:30 in the morning. As the aircraft taxis toward the dock, Nimitz gets his first direct view of the devastation. The water is still covered with oil. The harbor smells of fuel and burned metal. Arizona sits on the bottom with her superstructure barely above water. Oklahoma is completely capsized, her hull painted rust red by the barnacles that once covered her bottom. West Virginia is settled in the mud with only her main deck visible. Nevada, which tried to sortie during the attack and nearly made it out of the harbor, is beached to prevent her from sinking. The repair crews working on the wrecks look up as the flying boat passes, then return to their work. There is no cheering, no ceremony, just exhausted men trying to salvage what they can from the wreckage. Admiral Husband Kimmel meets Nimitz at the dock. The man who commanded the Pacific Fleet a week ago looks hollow, his face gray with exhaustion and shock. Kimmel has aged a decade in 18 days. They shake hands formally. Kimmel offers to brief Nimitz on the current situation. They drive to the headquarters building at the submarine base, passing rows of damaged ships and buildings, still marked by bomb craters. Kimmel's briefing is thorough and professional, but Nimitz can hear the despair underneath. The carriers are at sea conducting sweeps for the Japanese fleet. The battleships that can be salvaged will take months or years to repair. The ones that can't, Arizona, Oklahoma, will remain as memorials to American unpreparedness. Kimmel hands over his command with quiet dignity. He will return to the mainland to face a board of inquiry. His career is over. Nimitz accepts the burden with equal formality. Later, Nimitz will tell his staff that Kimmel was a competent officer who was made a scapegoat for systemic failures. But that conversation is for later. Now there is only the work. The change of command ceremony is deliberately low-key. There are no bands, no formations, no speeches. On the deck of the submarine USS Grayling, moored at the submarine base, Nimitz reads his orders assuming command of the United States Pacific Fleet. The assembled officers salute. Nimitz returns the salute. The ceremony takes less than 5 minutes. When it's over, Nimitz walks back to his headquarters and calls his first staff meeting. 30 officers crowd into the conference room. They look at him expectantly, waiting for the new commander to tell them how he plans to salvage this disaster. Nimitz stands at the head of the table and speaks quietly, without notes. "We've taken our beating," he says. "We've lost our battle fleet, but we have our carriers, our submarines, and our fighting spirit. The Japanese think they've won. They've only succeeded in making us angry. Now, we're going to show them what a mistake they made." The officers begin to sit up straighter. "Gentlemen," Nimitz continues, "we have work to do." The meeting lasts 4 hours. By the time it ends, the officers file out with something they haven't felt since December 7th: purpose. The man who couldn't get into West Point has taken command of the shattered Pacific Fleet. The education and failure that began with a grounding in the Philippines 34 years ago is about to be tested on a scale no one could have imagined. Pearl Harbor, January 1st, 1942. The clock strikes midnight, marking not just a new year, but the beginning of a new kind of war. In his office at the submarine base, Admiral Chester Nimitz gathers his senior commanders for their first strategic planning session. The room is cramped, still smelling of fresh paint from hasty repairs. Maps of the Pacific cover every wall, spanning from Hawaii to Japan, from Alaska to Australia. The sheer scale of the theater is overwhelming. Over 60 million square miles of ocean, thousands of islands, distances that make European warfare look like battles in a phone booth. Nimitz studies the faces of the men around the table. Some he knows well from decades of service together. Others are new to him, recommended by subordinates or by his own research into personnel files. What they all share is his trust. And in the coming months, that trust will be tested in ways none of them can yet imagine. The question facing Nimitz is fundamental. What kind of commanders does this new war require? The battleship admirals who dominated the pre-war Navy are suddenly obsolete, their expertise in surface gunnery and fleet formations irrelevant to a carrier war. But carrier aviation is itself barely understood. The Navy has spent 2 decades treating carriers as scouts and battleship support, not as independent striking forces. There are no textbooks on carrier task force operations, no proven doctrines for coordinating airstrikes across hundreds of miles, no established procedures for night carrier operations or fleet air defense. Nimitz needs commanders who can invent tactics in real time, who can learn from failures without being paralyzed by them, who can be aggressive without being reckless. He needs men who don't yet exist in the Navy's institutional memory. So, he decides to create them. His first critical decision involves Vice Admiral William Frederick Halsey, commander of Task Force 8, built around the carrier Enterprise. Halsey is 59 years old, a naval aviator who earned his wings in his 50s because he recognized that carriers would dominate modern warfare. He has a bulldog face, aggressive instincts, and a nickname, Bull, that captures his personality perfectly. Halsey believes in hitting the enemy hard and often, in taking risks, in maintaining offensive spirit even when the strategic situation is defensive. Many senior officers consider him reckless. Some question whether his aggressive temperament is suitable for the careful, methodical campaign that conventional wisdom says the Pacific War requires. Nimitz studies Halsey's record and makes a decision that will prove crucial. He doesn't just keep Halsey in command. He gives him free rein to conduct offensive raids throughout the Central Pacific. America needs victories, even small ones. Halsey is the man to deliver them. February 1st, 1942. Nimitz summons Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance to Pearl Harbor. Spruance is 55 years old, commands Cruiser Division 5, and has never served on an aircraft carrier. He is the opposite of Halsey in almost every way. Quiet where Halsey is bombastic. Analytical where Halsey is instinctive. Cautious where Halsey is aggressive. Spruance is known throughout the Navy as a brilliant tactical thinker, a man who can calculate angles of approach and fuel consumption rates in his head, who reads Japanese naval doctrine for recreation, who never makes a decision without considering every variable. Most officers assume Spruance's cruiser command is his final posting before retirement. Carriers go to aviators, everyone knows that. Nimitz doesn't care about everyone's assumptions. He sees in Spruance something rare, a commander who prioritizes mission over glory, who will protect an objective even when more spectacular opportunities present themselves. Nimitz makes a note in his personnel file. When the time comes for a critical operation requiring iron discipline and perfect judgment, Spruance will get a carrier task force. The aviators will protest. Nimitz will ignore them. The third key figure in Nimitz's command structure is Vice Admiral Robert Lee Gormley, assigned to command the South Pacific area. Gormley is competent, experienced, and fundamentally pessimistic about America's chances in the Pacific. He looks at Japanese conquests, the Philippines falling, Singapore under siege, the Dutch East Indies being overrun, and sees an unstoppable tide. He worries constantly about logistics, reinforcements, air cover. He drafts cautious operational plans that minimize risk. In peacetime, Gormley's caution would be a virtue. In the desperate spring of 1942, it becomes a liability. Nimitz watches Gormley carefully, hoping he will rise to the challenge. But he also begins looking for a replacement, just in case. He settles on Vice Admiral William Halsey as the alternate South Pacific commander. The irony is perfect. If the pessimist fails, the aggressive optimist will take over. Between Spruance's caution and Halsey's aggression, Nimitz will navigate the Pacific War. But Nimitz's most important relationship is not with a commander, but with an intelligence officer. Commander Edwin Thomas Layton is the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, a Japanese language specialist who has spent years studying the Imperial Navy. Layton represents everything that failed at Pearl Harbor. Intelligence officers had detected signs of the coming attack, but failed to convince commanders to act. He expects to be relieved, sent back to Washington in disgrace. Instead, Nimitz summons him to the office and asks him a question. "What can you tell me about Japanese intentions?" Layton, surprised, launches into a detailed briefing on Japanese carrier movements, likely operational plans and strategic objectives. Nimitz listens carefully, asks pointed questions, then makes a decision that will transform the intelligence war. He institutes daily intelligence briefings for himself and his senior commanders. Every morning, Layton will brief Nimitz on the latest intelligence. Every assessment will be challenged, questioned, refined. Most importantly, Nimitz makes clear that he will base operational decisions on intelligence estimates even when those estimates are uncertain. In a Navy that traditionally values combat experience over intelligence analysis, this is revolutionary. March 4th, 1942. Nimitz faces his first major test from Washington. Admiral Ernest King, now Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, sends an urgent message demanding immediate offensive action. King is brilliant, abrasive, and impatient. He wants raids against Japanese positions, attacks on their commerce, visible evidence that the Pacific Fleet is fighting back. The pressure is immense. The American public is demanding revenge for Pearl Harbor. Congress is asking why the Navy isn't doing more. Newspaper editorials question whether the Pacific Fleet Command is up to the task. Nimitz reads King's message and then ignores it. Not completely. He approves limited raids on Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands and Wake Island, but he refuses to commit his carriers to poorly planned operations that would satisfy political pressure at the cost of military effectiveness. It's a career risk. King could relieve him. But Nimitz has calculated that King values results over obedience. He's willing to run interference with Washington if it means protecting his commanders from pressure to do something stupid just to look active. The strategy pays off in ways Nimitz didn't anticipate. On February 1st, 1942, Halsey's Task Force 8 raids the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, hitting Japanese installations and supply bases. The damage is modest, but the psychological impact is significant. America has struck back. On February 24th, Halsey raids Wake Island. On March 4th, he raids Marcus Island, only 1,000 miles from Tokyo. The raids don't change the strategic balance. Japan is still conquering the Western Pacific, but they change American morale. The press celebrates Halsey as a fighting admiral. More importantly, the raids give American carrier crews combat experience without risking the fleet in decisive battles. They're learning how to launch strikes, coordinate fighter coverage, conduct damage control, navigate by dead reckoning across empty ocean. Each raid is a training exercise paid for in blood. The lessons learned will prove invaluable in 6 months when the real battles begin. Then comes a raid that goes beyond anything Nimitz has authorized, a mission so audacious that it should never work. In early April, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle approaches the Navy with an insane proposal. Load 16 B-25 bombers onto the carrier Hornet, sail to within 400 miles of Japan, launch the bombers to strike Tokyo, and have them continue to airfields in China. The bombers are too big to land on a carrier, so it's a one-way mission. The Hornet would have to sail deep into Japanese-controlled waters, exposing herself to attack. If Japanese patrol planes spot the task force, the entire mission would have to be aborted. Nimitz listens to the briefing and asks a single question. What are the chances of getting the Hornet back safely? Doolittle estimates 60%. Nimitz thinks for a moment, then approves the mission. It violates every principle of risk management. It commits a precious carrier to a raid that will do negligible military damage. But Nimitz understands something that pure military logic misses. America needs a psychological victory. The mission launches April 18th. The bombers strike Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. The damage is trivial, but the impact is seismic. Americans go wild with celebration. The Japanese high command is humiliated and enraged. By late April, Nimitz has assembled the command team that will fight the Pacific War. Halsey will provide aggressive action and high morale. Spruance will provide careful judgment and tactical perfection. The intelligence officers will provide the information that transforms battles from gambles to calculated risks. And Nimitz himself will provide the strategic vision that holds everything together, protecting his commanders from Washington's interference, giving them freedom to operate within his overall framework, and carefully balancing aggression with caution. He has learned from his own court-martial 35 years ago. Trust your subordinates, give them clear missions, protect them from political pressure, and accept that they will make mistakes. The system isn't perfect. Gormley will fail in the South Pacific and have to be replaced by Halsey. Some commanders will prove inadequate and will have to be relieved. But the fundamental approach, choosing aggressive, intelligent commanders and giving them freedom to operate, will prove decisive. The man who built this team is the man who couldn't get into West Point, who ran his first ship aground, who spent years in unglamorous staff positions. Chester Nimitz learned that leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about surrounding yourself with smart people and getting out of their way. In the desperate spring of 1942, that wisdom will make all the difference. Pearl Harbor, February the 14th, 1942. Deep in the basement of the administration building at the submarine base, Commander Joseph John Rochefort sits at a desk surrounded by stacks of paper covered in Japanese characters. The room is cramped, windowless, and perpetually cold from the air conditioning required to protect sensitive materials. Rochefort wears a red velvet smoking jacket and carpet slippers instead of a uniform because he finds them more comfortable for the 18-hour shifts he's been working for weeks. His team at Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptanalysis unit in Hawaii, is engaged in the most important invisible battle of the Pacific War. They are trying to break the Imperial Navy's operational code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence. If they succeed, the United States will know what Japan plans before they do it. If they fail, America will keep stumbling blind through a war it's losing. Success or failure might hinge on a single character misinterpreted, a single pattern overlooked. Rochefort lights another cigarette and returns to the intercepts. The science of breaking codes is part mathematics, part linguistics, and part inspired guesswork. The Japanese naval code uses a system called a code book, where groups of numbers represent words or phrases, enciphered through an additive process that makes the numbers meaningless without the key. Station Hypo has recovered parts of earlier versions of JN-25 through a combination of captured documents, direction finding of radio transmissions, and patient analysis of thousands of messages. They can read perhaps 10 to 15% of any given message, enough to frustrate them with glimpses of meaning, but not enough to reconstruct complete orders. Rochefort's breakthrough insight is that you don't need to read everything to understand intentions. A partially decrypted message mentioning carriers, fuel calculations, and a grid reference might indicate a planned operation, even if you can't read the specific orders. Intelligence isn't about perfect information. It's about making educated guesses good enough to matter. Admiral Nimitz understands this in ways that most combat officers don't. His first visit to Station Hypo in mid-February shocks the cryptanalysts. Fleet commanders don't normally visit basement offices. They summon intelligence officers to headquarters for briefings. But Nimitz comes to them, descending the narrow stairs into the Codebreaker's lair. He spends 2 hours asking technical questions about Japanese radio procedures, code structure, and analytical methods. He doesn't pretend to understand the cryptographic mathematics, but he grasps the operational implications. When Rochefort cautions that intelligence estimates are based on incomplete information and could be wrong, Nimitz nods. "I understand," he says, "but your best guess is better than me operating blind. I'll take the risk." That conversation fundamentally changes the relationship between intelligence and operations. Rochefort now knows his work will directly influence battle decisions, and Nimitz now has a strategic advantage. He will know enough about Japanese intentions to position his forces where they can do the most damage. The system is tested in March when Station Hypo intercepts Japanese communications, suggesting a major operation toward Port Moresby in New Guinea. The decrypt is fragmentary, filled with gaps and uncertain translations. Rochefort estimates 70% confidence that the Japanese plan an amphibious invasion of Port Moresby supported by carriers. If he's right, this is a chance to intercept and damage the Japanese fleet. If he's wrong, Nimitz will commit his scarce carriers to an empty ocean while the real attack happens elsewhere. Washington intelligence officers at Station Negat are skeptical. They think the target might be in the Central Pacific or even toward Alaska. Nimitz listens to the arguments from both camps, then asks Rochefort a question. "If you had to bet your career on it, what's your assessment?" Rochefort doesn't hesitate. "Port Moresby, Admiral. I'd stake my career on it." Nimitz orders Task Force 17, built around the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, to proceed toward the Coral Sea. The gamble is immense. America only has 4 operational carriers in the Pacific. Nimitz is committing 2 of them, based on partially decrypted radio intercepts. May 4th through 8th, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea proves both the value and the limitations of intelligence-based operations. Station Hypo was right about Japanese intentions. A major invasion force is heading toward Port Moresby, covered by the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. American carriers find the Japanese fleet and launch strikes, but the battle is confusing, chaotic, and inconclusive in ways that highlight how much the Navy still has to learn. On May 7th, American pilots mistake the destroyer Kikuzuki for a carrier and sink it while the real carriers escape detection. On May 8th, Lexington is hit by 2 torpedoes and 3 bombs. Her crew fights to save her for hours before internal explosions from aviation, fuel vapors, force abandonment. Over 200 sailors die. Yorktown is damaged but survives. The Japanese lose the light carrier Shoho, and the fleet carrier Shokaku is heavily damaged. Neither side wins decisively, but the invasion of Port Moresby is turned back. More importantly, Nimitz has proven that intelligence-driven operations can work. American carriers were in the right place at the right time because cryptanalysts in a basement in Pearl Harbor read enough of the enemy's mail to anticipate their moves. But success creates new challenges. Washington intelligence officers, embarrassed that Station Hypo was right when they were wrong, begin political maneuvering to take control of Pacific intelligence. They argue that cryptanalysis should be centralized in Washington, where more resources are available. Station Negat should interpret intelligence and Station Hypo should merely forward raw intercepts. Rochefort fights back, arguing that intelligence officers need to be close to the commanders who will use their assessments. The bureaucratic warfare intensifies throughout May. Meanwhile, Station Hypo intercepts new Japanese communications, suggesting another major operation, this one much larger and more critical than the Coral Sea. The Japanese are using a new designator in their messages, AF. Rochefort's team begins the painstaking work of identifying what AF means. The methodologies are creative bordering on devious. Direction finding suggests the messages originate from commands associated with the Central Pacific. Analysis of supply requisitions mentions cargo normally associated with operations against fixed land targets rather than mobile fleet actions. Some intercepted messages reference AF in connection with freshwater supplies, suggesting an island installation rather than a ship. Late May 1942. Rochefort stakes his career on a conclusion that will change the war. AF is Midway Island. He bases this assessment on cumulative evidence, direction finding, logistics references, and a brilliant piece of deception. Station Hypo convinces Midway to send an uncoded message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant has broken down. Within 2 days, Japanese intercepts reference AF having water problems. The test is crude but effective. Rochefort now knows with near certainty that Japan is planning a massive operation against Midway. The intercepts suggest 4 carriers, multiple battleships, an invasion force. The date is early June, probably around the 4th or 5th. Intelligence officers in Washington remain skeptical. They think AF might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska or even the West Coast. A major Japanese fleet approaching the Aleutians simultaneously adds to the confusion. Is the Aleutians attack the main effort or a diversion? If Nimitz concentrates his carriers at Midway and Washington is right, the Aleutians will fall and the West Coast will be exposed. If Washington is right and Nimitz is wrong, he will have gambled and lost. The confrontation between Nimitz and Washington intelligence reaches a crisis point in late May. Admiral King wants confirmation before committing carriers. How certain is Rochefort? What if the intelligence is a Japanese deception? Nimitz calls a conference with his senior intelligence officers and operational commanders. Commander Layton presents Rochefort's analysis. 4 Japanese carriers approaching Midway in early June, supported by invasion forces. The operation is intended to occupy Midway and lure the American carriers into a decisive battle. Washington's counter-assessment is presented. Insufficient evidence, possible deception, recommend caution. The room falls silent. Every officer knows this is the critical decision of the war so far. Commit based on fragmentary intelligence or wait for more certainty. Nimitz looks at Layton and asks the question he asked before Coral Sea. If you had to bet your career, what's your assessment? Layton repeats Rochefort's conclusions almost verbatim. Nimitz turns to his operations officer. Order Task Force 16 and Task Force 17 to deploy northeast of Midway. Position them to ambush the Japanese carrier force when it approaches. The decision is made. America's 3 operational carriers will concentrate at Midway based on codebreaking that Washington thinks is wrong. The next week is agony for Rochefort and his team. More intercepts arrive, each one scrutinized for confirmation or contradiction of their assessments. The date solidifies, June 4th. The force composition becomes clearer. Carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, plus the carriers Junyo and Ryujo operating toward the Aleutians. Battleships and cruisers in support. Invasion transports with 5,000 troops. The operation is massive, the stakes total. If Station Hypo is right and American carriers ambush the Japanese fleet, the Pacific War will fundamentally shift. If Station Hypo is wrong and the carriers are elsewhere, American forces at Midway will be annihilated and Pearl Harbor will be under threat again. Rochefort works through the night as June 4th approaches, checking and rechecking every intercept, every translation, every assessment. His team hasn't slept more than a few hours and days. The pressure is unbearable. But the intelligence holds. Everything points to Midway on June 4th. At 0300 hours on June 3rd, Rochefort sends his final intelligence estimate to Nimitz. 4 carriers approaching Midway from the northwest, arriving morning of June 4th. Intention to launch airstrikes at dawn. Nimitz reads the message and issues his final orders to Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16. You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk. The Battle of Midway will prove Rochefort and Station Hypo spectacularly right. But in late May, as American carriers steam toward ambush positions based on fragmentary decrypts of enemy communications, no one knows for certain. The entire Pacific War hangs on the judgment of a commander in a smoking jacket working in a basement, and an admiral who trusts intelligence more than conventional wisdom. Nimitz's willingness to bet his fleet on code-breaking transforms intelligence from an interesting accessory to the primary driver of Pacific strategy. After Midway, every operation will begin with an intelligence assessment. After Midway, commanders who ignore intelligence will be relieved. After Midway, the relationship between the man in the basement and the admiral at headquarters will be the most important command relationship in the Pacific. But first, the codebreakers have to be proven right, and that proof will come in the skies over Midway in less than a week. June 3rd, 1942. Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz stands in his headquarters operations room, studying the map of the Central Pacific with an intensity that makes his staff nervous. 300 miles northeast of Midway Island, his carriers are waiting in ambush. Task Force 16 consists of Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Task Force 17 is Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese carriers that intelligence says are approaching from the northwest. The odds are bad, but not impossible. Everything depends on surprise. If the Japanese detect the American carriers before the battle begins, they'll have overwhelming advantage. If Spruance and Fletcher can launch first, they have a chance. Nimitz has done everything he can from Pearl Harbor. The outcome now depends on junior officers and enlisted men he'll never meet. The waiting is agony. The Japanese plan is elegant and complex, the kind of operation that works perfectly in planning rooms and falls apart when reality intervenes. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, has designed a multi-pronged attack intended to occupy Midway and destroy the American carrier fleet. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, will approach from the northwest and launch strikes against Midway's air defenses. Once Midway is neutralized, invasion forces will land and capture the island. American carriers, responding to the invasion, will sortie from Pearl Harbor and sail into a trap. The Japanese carriers will be waiting, supported by battleships and cruisers, including Yamamoto's flagship, the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. On paper, it's brilliant. In practice, it assumes American carriers are still at Pearl Harbor. Station Hypo's code-breaking has given Nimitz the one advantage Yamamoto never considered. The Americans know he's coming. June 4th. 0430 hours. 150 miles northwest of Midway. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo orders his carriers to launch the first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, bombers, and fighters take off in the pre-dawn darkness. The 4 carriers turn into the wind, their flight decks illuminated by dim red lights to preserve the pilot's night vision. The launch takes 30 minutes. As the last aircraft climbs away toward Midway, Nagumo faces the central dilemma that will doom his fleet. Half his aircraft are striking Midway. The other half are on the hangar decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship attack in case American carriers appear. Nagumo doesn't know where the American carriers are. Japanese scout planes are searching the ocean to the east, but so far they've found nothing. Nagumo decides to wait. If scouts find American carriers, he'll launch immediately. If not, he'll recover the Midway strike force and then launch everything at once. It's a reasonable decision based on the information available. It's also the decision that will cost him the battle. 0530 hours. A PBY Catalina patrol aircraft from Midway Radio's contact. Many planes heading Midway. The Japanese strike is inbound. 20 minutes later, another Catalina reports. Enemy carriers. The message is fragmentary, giving only a bearing and approximate distance, but it's enough. American commanders now know the Japanese fleet position. On Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher immediately orders Spruance to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located. Spruance faces his own dilemma. Launch now at maximum range while his position is still unknown, or wait for better targeting information and risk losing surprise. He calculates fuel consumption, flight times, and recovery windows. Then he makes the aggressive decision. Launch everything at absolute maximum range. Better to run out of fuel returning than to miss the opportunity. At 0700 hours, Enterprise and Hornet begin launching their strike groups. 116 aircraft climb away toward the Japanese fleet. Most of them will barely have enough fuel to return. Some won't make it back at all. The Japanese strike on Midway is hitting the island with devastating effect. Bombs crater the runways, destroy buildings, kill dozens of Marines. But the island's air defenses are fighting back harder than expected. Japanese pilots radio back to Nagumo. There is need for a second attack on Midway. At 0715 hours, Nagumo makes a fatal decision. He orders his reserve strike force, the aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship attack, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second Midway strike. The ordnance crews on Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu begin the laborious process of bringing aircraft up from the hangar decks, removing torpedoes, rolling bombs into position, and hoisting them onto the aircraft. Torpedoes are stacked on the hangar decks to clear working space. Aviation fuel hoses are strung across the decks to refuel aircraft. The carriers become floating arsenals where one spark could cause catastrophe. Then, at 0728 hours, everything changes. A Japanese scout plane that launched late due to mechanical problems finally radios a report. 10 enemy surface ships sighted. The message gives a bearing, but no details about ship types. Nagumo demands clarification. Are there carriers? The scout doesn't respond immediately. Nagumo is now trapped. His Midway strike force is returning, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. His reserve strike force is being rearmed with the wrong ordnance. And American carriers are somewhere to the northeast. At 0745 hours, the scout plane finally sends the message Nagumo has been dreading. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo orders another change. Stop rearming with bombs, rearm with torpedoes, prepare for anti-ship attack. The ordnance crews, exhausted and confused, begin reversing their work. Bombs are removed, torpedoes are brought back out, more fuel hoses are strung. The hangar decks are now cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft in various states of loading. And the Midway strike force is beginning to arrive overhead, desperate to land. Nagumo makes a command decision that seems logical. Recover the Midway strike force first, then launch against the American carriers. He can't leave his pilots in the air to run out of fuel and crash. From 0800 to 0900 hours, all 4 Japanese carriers conduct landing operations. Aircraft are recovered, refueled, and rearmed as quickly as possible. The strike force against the American carriers is spotted on the flight decks, ready to launch. By 0920 hours, Nagumo is almost ready. Just a few more minutes to position the fleet and turn into the wind for launch. His 4 carriers are in a square formation, about 2,000 yards apart. The morning sky is clear. Combat air patrol fighters circle overhead. Everything is ready. Nagumo is about to launch the largest carrier strike of the war. Then, at 10:20 hours, American dive bombers arrive overhead. The sequence of events that follows happens with such speed that it seems almost preordained. The American strike has fragmented during the approach. Torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown attack separately between 0930 and 1000 hours. They come in low and slow, perfect targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 41 torpedo bombers attack. 35 are shot down. Not a single torpedo hits. The attacks appear to be a complete failure, but they have an unintended effect. Japanese fighters are drawn down to sea level, chasing torpedo bombers. The combat air patrol is out of position, and the carriers are maneuvering violently to avoid torpedoes, breaking formation. At 10:22 hours, 37 dive bombers from Enterprise, Squadron VB6 and VS6, arrive overhead at 14,000 feet. The Japanese carriers are directly below them, their decks packed with aircraft being armed and fueled. There are no fighters at altitude to intercept. The dive bombers push over and begin their attack runs. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey leads the Enterprise air group down on Kaga and Akagi. The dive bombers fall out of the sky at 250 miles per hour. A near vertical descent that makes them almost impossible to shoot. At 1,500 feet, the pilots release their 1,000-pound bombs and pull out of their dives. In the space of 3 minutes, Kaga is hit by 4 bombs. One penetrates the flight deck and explodes in the hangar, detonating the ordnance and fuel stored there. Secondary explosions tear through the ship. The flight deck buckles and splits. Within minutes, Kaga is burning uncontrollably, her crew abandoning ship. Akagi takes one bomb hit that seems minor, a near miss that detonates near the stern. But the explosion ruptures fuel lines and ignites aviation fuel on the hangar deck. Fire spreads with terrifying speed through the ordnance and aircraft. Admiral Nagumo is forced to evacuate his flagship. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Yorktown, Squadron WW2, attack Soryu. 3 bombs hit in rapid succession. Soryu's forward elevator is blown out of its shaft. The ship is transformed into an inferno in minutes. In 6 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:28 hours, 3 Japanese fleet carriers are mortally wounded. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, escapes detection and launches a counterattack that severely damages Yorktown. But by mid-afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise find and destroy Hiryu. By evening on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months ago are sinking or abandoned. The battle continues for another 2 days as Japanese and American forces maneuver, trying to gain advantage. But the decisive blow has been struck. Japan has lost 4 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and thousands of experienced pilots and crew. The American losses are painful. Yorktown sinks on June 7th, and 145 aircraft are lost. But the exchange ratio is catastrophically in America's favor. The Pacific War has fundamentally shifted. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz receives the first reports of the battle with cautious optimism that gradually transforms into stunned elation. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. The enemy fleet in retreat. Midway held. By June 6th, when the full scope of the victory becomes clear, Nimitz faces a new question. Should he pursue? Admiral King in Washington wants aggressive follow-up. Some of Nimitz's own staff argue for chasing the retreating Japanese fleet, trying to destroy their battleships and transports. But Nimitz remembers his principle of calculated risk. His carriers have been fighting continuously for 3 days. Pilots are exhausted. Aircraft maintenance is overdue. And somewhere to the west are Japanese battleships with 18-inch guns that could annihilate a carrier in a night surface action. Nimitz orders his forces to break off and return to Pearl Harbor. The criticism is immediate. Why didn't he pursue and finish the job? But Nimitz has achieved what he needed. The Japanese momentum has been broken. The offensive is now possible. The historical debate about Midway will continue for decades. Was it brilliant American strategy or incredible luck? The truth, as Nimitz understands, is both. Station Hypo's code-breaking gave the Americans strategic surprise. Spruance's decision to launch at maximum range got the strike groups airborne before the Japanese were ready. The Japanese decision to rearm their aircraft twice created vulnerability. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons drew the Japanese fighters out of position. McCluskey's navigation error that led him to the Japanese fleet at the exact moment of vulnerability was pure chance. And the dive bombers' arrival during the 6-minute window when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable was the intersection of luck and preparation. Nimitz will later tell an interviewer, Midway wasn't won by any single decision or any single person. It was won by hundreds of decisions by hundreds of men, most of whose names will never be known. But when he writes his after-action report, he is careful to credit Station Hypo and Commander Rochefort. The codebreakers deserve recognition for making the ambush possible. The strategic implications of Midway take months to fully emerge. Japan's carrier striking force is crippled. The Imperial Navy still has more carriers than America. Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, Ryujo, and several light carriers remain operational. But the loss of 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots is irreplaceable in the short term. More importantly, Japan has lost the initiative. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces advanced across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. After Midway, they will never again mount a major offensive operation. The psychological impact is equally significant. The The myth of Japanese invincibility is shattered. American morale, which has been sustained by desperate hope since December, is now reinforced by victory. Nimitz has delivered what Roosevelt needed, proof that America can win the Pacific War. But Midway is not the end. It's barely the beginning. Japan still controls most of the Western Pacific. The Marines are about to land on Guadalcanal, beginning a campaign that will make Midway look like a skirmish. The 6 minutes that changed the war happened on June 4th. The next 3 years will determine whether America can sustain the momentum those 6 minutes created. August 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. At 06:14 in the morning, Marines from the 1st Division wade ashore on beaches designated red and blue. They expect fierce resistance. Instead, they find empty jungle and abandoned positions. The Japanese garrison fled inland when the bombardment began. Within hours, 11,000 Marines are ashore and advancing toward their primary objective, an unfinished airfield the Japanese have been constructing. By 1600 hours, the Marines control the airfield and begin the work of completing it. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the operation is being celebrated as a textbook amphibious assault. But the Marines on Guadalcanal know better. This isn't victory, this is the easy part. The Japanese will be back, and when they return, the Marines will learn just how little America understands about fighting in the Pacific. The strategic logic behind the Guadalcanal operation is sound. Japanese forces are building airfields throughout the Solomon Islands, extending their reach toward Australia and threatening Allied supply lines. If the Japanese complete the Guadalcanal airfield, their bombers will control the entire South Pacific. Admiral Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur agree the airfield must be captured before it becomes operational. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandegrift, is chosen for the assault. The problem is timing. The Marines have trained for amphibious operations, but they have never conducted an opposed landing. The Navy has escorted them to the target. But the Navy is terrified of Japanese naval forces in the area, and the entire operation has been planned in less than 2 months. No one has thought through what happens after the landing. How will the Marines be supplied? How will they be reinforced? How long will the Navy stay to provide cover? These questions don't have answers. They'll be answered in blood over the next 6 months. August 8th. 0200 hours. A Japanese naval force approaches Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commands 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, intent on destroying the American transports, unloading supplies for the Marines. The Allied naval force screening the invasion, 3 American and 2 Australian cruisers, is unprepared for night combat. Japanese lookouts spot the Allied ships first. Japanese gunners open fire at 0138. The Battle of Savo Island lasts 32 minutes. When it's over, 4 Allied cruisers are sinking: USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra. 1,077 Allied sailors are dead. Japanese casualties are negligible, 58 killed. It's the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy in a fair fight. And it exposes a horrifying truth. The Imperial Navy owns the night. American ships have radar, theoretically giving them an advantage in darkness. But radar is new technology, poorly understood. And the operators aren't trained to interpret the returns. Japanese ships have no radar. They have something better: years of intensive night combat training, superior optical equipment, and the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, which is faster and longer range than anything America possesses. The defeat at Savo Island triggers a crisis. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious force, decides his transports are too vulnerable to remain at Guadalcanal. On August 9th, he orders the supply ships to withdraw, taking with them much of the Marines' heavy equipment, ammunition, and rations. Major General Vandegrift watches the ships sail away with growing horror. His Marines have been ashore for 2 days. They hold an airfield with no aircraft, a perimeter they can barely defend, and supplies for maybe 3 weeks. The Navy has abandoned them. Vandegrift radios. Pearl Harbor. Marines on Guadalcanal are now in a precarious position. Nimitz, reading the message, understands the magnitude of the disaster. The Navy has landed Marines on an island and then left them to die. If the Marines are overrun, the political consequences will be catastrophic. More importantly, Nimitz will have sacrificed an entire division for nothing. He orders the Navy to resume supply runs to Guadalcanal, regardless of risk. But the order is easier to give than to execute. Every ship that approaches Guadalcanal is vulnerable to Japanese air attack by day and naval attack by night. Supplying the Marines becomes a desperate race against time and Japanese firepower. The Marines on Guadalcanal give the captured airfield a name, Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. Working with captured Japanese construction equipment, Navy Seabees, and brutal physical labor, they complete the runway by August 17th. The first American aircraft land the next day, 19 Wildcat fighters and 12 Dauntless dive bombers. Henderson Field is now operational, giving the Americans their own air cover, but the base is primitive beyond description. The runway is pierced steel planking laid over coral. There are no revetments to protect aircraft from shelling. Fuel is stored in 55-gallon drums scattered through the jungle. Ammunition is stacked in the open. Maintenance is conducted with hand tools. The pilots sleep in tents when they sleep at all, and every night, Japanese warships bombard the field from offshore, a terror the Marines call the Tokyo Express. Destroyers race down from Rabaul, shell Henderson Field for hours, and race back before American aircraft can catch them at dawn. Sleep becomes impossible. Casualties mount from exhaustion as much as combat. The Japanese respond to the American presence on Guadalcanal with a series of ground assaults that reveal a shocking difference in tactical doctrine. Japanese infantry tactics emphasize aggressive night attacks, infiltration, and close combat. American Marines are trained for firepower and coordinated defense. The resulting battles are savage and intimate. August 21st, 900 Japanese troops attack the Marine perimeter at Alligator Creek. The assault is preceded by a banzai charge, hundreds of soldiers screaming and running directly at Marine positions. The Marines cut them down with machine gun and rifle fire. Of 900 attackers, fewer than 100 survive. The Marines lose 44 killed, but the psychological impact on both sides is profound. The Marines learn that Japanese soldiers will accept suicidal casualties to achieve objectives. The Japanese learn that frontal assaults against prepared defenses are futile. The next attacks will be more sophisticated. September the 13th through 14th. The Battle of Edson's Ridge. 6,000 Japanese troops attack a position held by 800 Marine raiders and paratroopers. The Japanese plan is to overwhelm the position through repeated assaults, break through the Marine perimeter, and capture Henderson Field. The attacks continue throughout the night. Marines fight hand-to-hand in the darkness, throwing grenades, firing at muzzle flashes, calling in artillery on their own positions when the Japanese close to within meters. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the position, walks the ridgeline throughout the battle, rallying his men with calm precision while bullets snap past his head. By dawn on September 15th, the Japanese attack has collapsed. Japanese casualties, approximately 800 killed. Marine casualties, 104 killed, 278 wounded. The ridge is renamed Edson's Ridge, and the pattern is established. Japanese attacks will be tactically aggressive and strategically futile. American defenses will hold, but at horrific cost. The naval battles continue with similar brutality. October 11th through 12th, Battle of Cape Esperance. American cruisers intercept a Japanese supply convoy and sink one cruiser and one destroyer while losing one destroyer. October 26th, Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The carrier Hornet is sunk by Japanese aircraft. Enterprise is damaged. The Japanese lose no carriers but suffer heavy aircraft losses. November 12th through 15th, Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, the most savage surface action of the Pacific War. Over 3 nights, American and Japanese warships clash at point-blank range in the waters off Guadalcanal. The battleship USS South Dakota is hit by 42 shells, but survives. The battleship USS Washington sinks the Japanese battleship Kirishima with 9 16-inch shells in 7 minutes. The light cruiser USS Juneau is sunk by a submarine torpedo. Aide 687 sailors die, including the 5 Sullivan brothers, whose deaths will lead to the sole survivor policy. The waters around Guadalcanal are so littered with sunken ships that the Marines name it Iron Bottom Sound. 38 major warships rest on the bottom. Thousands of sailors are entombed in steel coffins. By December, the situation on Guadalcanal has transformed from desperate to merely terrible. The Marines hold Henderson Field. The Navy has established a supply line, though it remains dangerous. Reinforcements have arrived, bringing the American troop strength to 36,000. The Japanese have committed similar numbers, but can't sustain the logistics of supplying them. Malnutrition, disease, and combat losses are destroying Japanese units faster than they can be replaced. But the cost to American forces is staggering. The 1st Marine Division has taken 60% casualties. Malaria is epidemic. Dysentery has hospitalized thousands. Combat fatigue, what will later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, is breaking men who survived months of combat. Admiral Nimitz visits Guadalcanal in September and is shocked by what he sees. Marines who landed in August as fit young men now look skeletal. Their eyes are hollow. They move with the mechanical exhaustion of men who have pushed past their limits and kept going because there's no alternative. The final Japanese evacuation occurs in February 1943. Over 3 nights, Japanese destroyers extract 11,000 troops from Guadalcanal, abandoning the island to American control. The Guadalcanal campaign is over. America has won its first major land victory of the Pacific War, but the price is sobering. 7,000 American casualties, including 1,600 killed, 38 ships sunk, over 200 aircraft lost. The Japanese losses are higher, 31,000 casualties, including 24,000 dead, but the exchange ratio is nowhere near what American planners hoped. Guadalcanal was supposed to demonstrate American dominance. Instead, it demonstrated how much Americans had to learn about jungle warfare, night combat, logistics, and sustained operations. Every lesson was paid for in blood. Every mistake cost lives. And the next operations up the Solomon Islands chain, across the Central Pacific toward the Philippines, would require applying those lessons while learning new ones. Nimitz later writes in his personal diary, "Guadalcanal was our apprenticeship. We passed, but barely. Now comes the real war." Pearl Harbor, January 15, 1943. In a meeting room at the submarine base, Admiral Chester Nimitz sits across from 20 submarine commanders, most of them frustrated, some of them angry. These men command America's undersea fleet, 51 submarines operating throughout the Pacific. They have been at war for 13 months. They have conducted hundreds of patrols. They have fired thousands of torpedoes at Japanese ships. And they have shockingly little to show for it. The problem isn't courage. Submarine duty has the highest casualty rate in the Navy. The problem isn't opportunity. Japanese merchant ships are everywhere. The problem is that American torpedoes don't work. And the bureaucrats in Washington who designed them refuse to admit it. Nimitz has summoned these commanders to tell them that he's going to fix the torpedo problem, even if it means declaring war on the Bureau of Ordnance. But first, he needs to understand exactly what's failing. The Mark 14 torpedo is a technological marvel that doesn't work. Developed throughout the 1930s at a cost of millions of dollars, it's designed to be the ultimate submarine weapon. It runs at 46 knots for 4,500 yards. It carries a 643-pound Torpex warhead. Most ingeniously, it uses a magnetic influence exploder that detonates the warhead when it passes through a ship's magnetic field, ideally beneath the keel where the explosion will break the ship's back. In theory, the Mark 14 is superior to anything Japan possesses. In practice, it has at least 3 catastrophic failures. First, the depth control mechanism is flawed, causing torpedoes to run 10 feet deeper than set. They pass harmlessly beneath their targets. Second, the magnetic exploder is so sensitive that it detonates prematurely or not at all, depending on the Earth's magnetic field, which varies by latitude. Third, when the backup contact exploder is used, the firing pin fails on impact angles greater than 45 degrees. Submarine commanders have been reporting these failures since December 1941. The Bureau of Ordnance insists the problem is operator error. Commander Dudley Walker, Mush Morton, exemplifies the frustration gripping the submarine force. Morton commands USS Wahoo, a Gato-class submarine operating out of Pearl Harbor. He is aggressive, innovative, and utterly contemptuous of conservative doctrine. In January 1943, during Wahoo's third war patrol, Morton conducts a surface attack on a Japanese convoy in broad daylight, something pre-war doctrine considers suicidal. He fires torpedoes at point-blank range, multiple hits, multiple sinkings. Then he does something unprecedented. He surfaces and engages surviving ships with Wahoo's deck gun, a 4-inch naval rifle meant for defense, not offense. Japanese sailors and lifeboats watch in disbelief as an American submarine fights like a surface warship. Morton sinks 4 ships in one patrol. When he returns to Pearl Harbor, he's celebrated as a hero. But in his patrol report, he details torpedo failures. Of 24 torpedoes fired, 14 malfunctioned. Without the failures, he could have sunk 8 ships instead of 4. Nimitz reads the report and makes a note. Morton is the kind of commander we need. The Bureau of Ordnance is the kind of obstacle we don't. The bureaucratic battle over torpedoes reaches a breaking point in May 1943. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines at Pearl Harbor, conducts controlled experiments proving the depth control mechanism is faulty. He fires torpedoes through nets suspended at measured depths. The torpedoes consistently run 10 feet deeper than set. Lockwood sends the data to the Bureau of Ordnance with a demand. Fix the problem, or we stop using your torpedoes. The Bureau's response is dismissive. Submarine commanders are setting depth controls incorrectly. Lockwood, furious, sends the data directly to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz reviews the evidence and makes a command decision that circumvents the entire Navy bureaucracy. He orders Lockwood to modify the Mark 14 depth mechanism independently, without Bureau of Ordnance approval. It's technically insubordination. Nimitz doesn't care. The war effort is being crippled by bureaucratic incompetence. By June, submarines are running with locally modified depth controls. Sinking rates immediately improve. The magnetic exploder problem proves even more difficult to resolve. Throughout the summer of 1943, submarine commanders conduct their own experiments. Commander Lawrence Daspit, commanding USS Tenosa, fires 15 torpedoes at a stationary tanker. 11 hit. None explode. Daspit, methodical and precise, saves his last 4 torpedoes and returns to Pearl Harbor with detailed documentation of each failure. The evidence is now overwhelming. The magnetic exploder is unreliable, but the Bureau of Ordnance still refuses to acknowledge the problem, arguing that combat conditions are different from controlled tests. In July, Admiral Lockwood makes an executive decision. All submarines under his command will deactivate the magnetic exploder and use only contact detonation. Again, it's done without official authorization. Admiral Nimitz supports the decision retroactively. But the contact exploder has its own flaw. The firing pin mechanism fails on direct hits. This won't be discovered until September, when USS Tenosa conducts more experiments. The complete solution, modified depth control, deactivated magnetic exploder, and redesigned contact exploder, isn't implemented until late 1943. America has wasted nearly 2 years of war with defective torpedoes. Once the torpedo problems are resolved, the submarine campaign transforms into the most effective economic warfare in naval history. Nimitz's background in submarine operations from 1909 to 1912 gives him unique insight into undersea warfare. He understands that submarines are most effective not in direct fleet actions, but in commerce raiding, sinking the merchant ships that carry oil, food, raw materials, and troops. Japan is an island nation dependent on imports. 60% of its oil comes from the Dutch East Indies, transported by tanker across thousands of miles of ocean. Its factories require iron ore, bauxite, rubber, and rare minerals from conquered territories. Its armies occupying China, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands require constant resupply. Destroy the merchant marine, and Japan's war effort collapses. Nimitz makes this explicit in his operational orders to submarine commanders. Merchant ships are priority targets. Military vessels are secondary. Tankers are most important. The goal is economic strangulation. The submarine offensive accelerates throughout 1944. American submarines operate in wolf packs, coordinated groups of 3 to 5 boats working together to attack convoys. They develop new tactics, surface attacks at night using radar, which submarines have but Japanese escorts don't. Deep diving to 300 feet to evade depth charges, deeper than Japanese doctrine assumes submarines can go. Approaching harbors and sinking ships at anchor, laying minefields in Japanese shipping lanes. The innovation is relentless because Nimitz protects aggressive commanders from conservative superiors. Commander Richard O'Kane in USS Tang develops a tactic called down-the-throat shots, firing torpedoes directly at charging escort vessels, forcing them to evade and breaking up their attack. Commander Eugene Fluckey in USS Barb conducts daring raids on Japanese coastal installations, landing demolition parties to destroy shore facilities. The submarine force is small, never more than 200 boats on patrol simultaneously, but its impact is disproportionate. The human cost is staggering. Of 16,000 men who serve in submarines during World War II, 3,500 are killed, a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of the U.S. military. 52 submarines are lost, some to enemy action, some to operational accidents, some to unknown causes that leave them listed as overdue presumed lost. The life of a submariner is claustrophobic terror interrupted by moments of explosive violence. Patrols last 60 to 75 days. Crews live in a steel tube 100 feet long by 30 feet wide, breathing recycled air, eating declining quality food, never seeing sunlight. When depth charges detonate nearby, the hull compresses inward with a sound like a hammer hitting a bell. Light bulbs shatter, cork insulation rains down. Men grip handrails and wait to see if the next charge will rupture the pressure hull and crush them to death. Those who survive multiple patrols develop a 1,000-yard stare that never quite goes away. By December 1944, American submarines have sunk approximately 1,000 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 4 million tons, 60% of Japan's pre-war merchant marine. Tanker losses are even more catastrophic. Japan began the war with 6 million tons of tanker capacity. By late 1944, only 700,000 tons remain. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies dropped from 4 million tons per year to fewer than 300,000 tons. Japanese industry is starving for fuel. Aircraft sit on the ground because there's no aviation gasoline. Warships remain in port because there's no bunker fuel. Training for pilots is reduced from hundreds of hours to dozens because fuel is scarce. The submarine campaign is winning the economic war. Japan's military remains powerful, but its industrial base is collapsing. Nimitz's personal involvement in the submarine campaign reflects his conviction that undersea warfare will prove decisive. He meets regularly with returning submarine commanders, debriefing them personally on tactics and targets. He reads every patrol report, making notes on successful innovations and ordering their dissemination to the entire submarine force. He attends ceremonies when submarines return from successful patrols, pinning medals on enlisted men as well as officers. He grieves when submarines are lost, writing personal letters to families, and he fights continuous bureaucratic battles with the Bureau of Ordnance, the Bureau of Personnel, and conservative admirals who still believe submarines are support vessels rather than strategic weapons. His protection of submarine commanders becomes legendary. When Commander Morton is criticized for aggressive tactics, Nimitz promotes him. When Commander O'Kane is accused of taking excessive risks, Nimitz defends him. The submarine force knows that their most important advocate isn't in Washington or at submarine headquarters. He's the Pacific Fleet commander who started his career in submarines 33 years ago and never forgot the lessons. The ultimate vindication of the submarine campaign comes in the strategic assessment of Japanese defeat. Post-war analysis reveals that American submarines sank 55% of all Japanese merchant ships lost during the war, 1,178 ships totaling 4,900,000 tons. They also sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including one battleship, 8 carriers, and 11 cruisers. The economic impact was catastrophic. By 1945, Japan's imports had fallen to 1/5 of pre-war levels. Factories closed for lack of raw materials. Cities starved because food couldn't be transported. The home islands were being isolated, while the military still controlled vast territories overseas. A Japanese admiral will later testify, "The blockade by American submarines was the most decisive single factor in our defeat. The man who made that blockade possible was the admiral who wore a bathrobe and carpet slippers in a basement, and the fleet commander who trusted him. Together, they proved that wars are won, not just by great battles, but by patient, systematic destruction of the enemy's ability to sustain the fight." Pearl Harbor, March 10, 1943. In the operations room at SINCPAC headquarters, Admiral Chester Nimitz stands before a map that dominates an entire wall. The map shows the Pacific Ocean from Hawaii to Japan, from the Aleutian Islands to Australia. Someone has drawn lines connecting American bases to potential targets, each line representing thousands of miles of empty ocean. The nearest American base to Japan is Pearl Harbor, 5,200 miles. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, 4,800 miles. From Pearl Harbor to Truk, Japan's primary naval base in the Central Pacific, 3,400 miles. These aren't just numbers, they're the fundamental problem of Pacific strategy. How do you project military power across distances greater than the width of the Atlantic Ocean when you don't have bases in between? How do you supply amphibious assaults when the supply lines stretch for months? The European theater is about seizing ground. The Pacific theater is about conquering distance. The scale of the Pacific dwarfs every previous naval campaign in history. Consider the logistics of moving a single Marine division from Hawaii to a combat landing. The division consists of 19,000 Marines, plus their equipment: trucks, jeeps, tanks, artillery, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, fuel, and water. Loading that division requires 40 transport ships. Escorting those transports requires a screen of destroyers and cruisers. Protecting the convoy requires carrier task forces. Supporting the landing requires battleships for shore bombardment. The total force exceeds 100 ships. Now consider that this force must travel 3,000 miles across open ocean, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection, arriving at the target simultaneously despite different ship speeds, and then conducting a opposed landing while subject to air attack and submarine threat. A single miscalculation in navigation or timing could result in disaster. And this is just one division in one operation. Winning the Pacific War requires dozens of such operations. The geography imposes another constraint. There is no continuous line of supply. In Europe, armies advance and supply lines follow them overland. In the Pacific, every advance creates a new gap that must be bridged by sea. Capture an island in the Gilberts, and you've added 1,000 miles to your supply line. Advance to the Marshalls, add another 700 miles. Move to the Marianas, add another 1,000 miles. Each forward base requires its own supply system: food, fuel, ammunition, replacement personnel, spare parts, construction materials. Ships that carry supplies aren't available for combat operations. Tankers that refuel the fleet can't carry troops. Every strategic decision is also a logistical equation. The Pacific War becomes an exercise in industrial management as much as military strategy. March 1943. Washington, D.C. The Combined Chiefs of Staff meeting brings together American and British military leaders to coordinate global strategy. The British argue that the Pacific should be a holding action, while resources concentrate on defeating Germany. The Americans, led by Admiral Ernest King, insist on a two-ocean war. The compromise divides the Pacific into two commands. General Douglas MacArthur controls the Southwest Pacific area, including Australia, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Admiral Nimitz controls the Central Pacific area, including Hawaii and the island chains leading to Japan. Neither commander is subordinate to the other. Both report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's a command structure designed by committee, guaranteed to create rivalry and duplication of effort. But it's also the only politically acceptable solution. MacArthur has powerful supporters in Congress and the press who won't accept his subordination to a Navy admiral. Nimitz is the Pacific Fleet commander. He can't be subordinated to an Army general. So, the theater is split, and the war will be fought on two parallel axes of advance. The dual advance creates opportunities as well as problems. The Japanese must defend everywhere, unable to predict whether the next American blow will fall in the Central Pacific or the Southwest Pacific. American forces can shift resources between theaters as opportunities emerge, but the split also means competition for scarce assets. MacArthur demands more ships, more air support, more ground forces. Nimitz makes the same demands. The Joint Chiefs must mediate between two strong-willed commanders, each convinced his strategy is correct and the other's is wasteful. The rivalry becomes personal. MacArthur publicly questions whether the Navy is committed to defeating Japan or merely protecting its bureaucratic interests. Nimitz, more diplomatic, suggests privately that MacArthur's drive to liberate the Philippines is motivated by ego as much as strategy. The tension will persist throughout the war. Nimitz's solution to the geography problem is innovative. If forward bases don't exist, create them. In mid-1943, the Navy establishes Service Squadron 10, a floating logistics base. The squadron consists of repair ships, ammunition ships, fuel tankers, refrigerated provision ships, hospital ships, and floating dry docks. Service Squadron 10 can position itself in a captured anchorage, Eniwetok, Ulithi, Manus, and provide the support that would normally require a major port facility. Ships can refuel, rearm, make repairs, transfer wounded, and take on supplies without returning to Pearl Harbor. The innovation extends fleet endurance from weeks to months. By late 1944, Service Squadron 10 at Ulithi Atoll supports over 600 ships simultaneously, more than at Pearl Harbor. The floating base concept revolutionizes naval warfare. No longer tied to fixed bases, the fleet can advance across the Pacific without waiting for shore facilities to be constructed. But capturing those forward anchorages requires solving the amphibious assault problem. The Marines learned brutal lessons at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Pre-landing reconnaissance is essential. Naval gunfire must be measured in days, not hours. Specialized landing craft are required for crossing reefs, and casualties will be horrific even with perfect planning. The Navy develops a standardized amphibious doctrine throughout 1943 and 1944. Underwater demolition teams swim ashore days before the assault to map obstacles and defenses. Naval gunfire begins 72 hours before landing and continues right up to the moment Marines hit the beach. Close air support coordinators embed with ground units to direct carrier strikes. Landing vehicle tracked, Amtraks, can cross reefs where traditional landing craft fail. The doctrine saves lives, though the improvement is relative. At Tarawa in November 1943, 1,589 Marines are killed in 76 hours. At Saipan in June 1944, 3,226 are killed in 24 days. The butcher's bill keeps rising even as the tactics improve. The geographic challenge produces one of Nimitz's most controversial strategic decisions: island hopping. The Japanese occupy hundreds of islands across the Central Pacific, garrisoned with thousands of troops. Traditional strategy would require capturing each island sequentially, but that approach would take decades. Nimitz proposes an alternative: bypass strongly defended islands, capture weakly defended ones that offer airfields and anchorages, and let the bypassed garrisons wither on the vine as their supplies are cut off. The strategy is both militarily effective and morally troubling. Thousands of Japanese soldiers will be left on isolated islands, slowly starving, unable to contribute to their nation's defense or evacuate to fight elsewhere. But the alternative, assaulting every fortified position, would cost tens of thousands of American lives. Nimitz chooses ruthless efficiency over humanitarian concerns. The bypassed garrisons aren't attacked, they're simply ignored. By war's end, over 100,000 Japanese troops are isolated on islands that never saw American assault. The ultimate expression of the geography problem is the Marianas Campaign of June 1944. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, lie 1,300 miles from Tokyo, close enough for B-29 bombers to reach the Japanese home islands. Capturing the Marianas will bring Japan under strategic bombardment for the first time. But the Marianas are 3,500 miles from Pearl Harbor. The invasion force consists of 535 ships carrying 127,000 troops. Coordinating this armada across the Pacific requires planning that begins 9 months in advance. Fuel consumption alone is staggering. The task force burns 400,000 barrels of oil just getting to the target. The logistics of supplying the invasion after the landing requires pre-positioning supplies at forward bases and establishing shuttle convoys. A single miscalculation would strand the invasion force without support. The operation succeeds, but the margin for error is razor thin. By mid-1944, Nimitz has solved the Pacific geography problem not through a single breakthrough, but through systematic innovation. Floating bases, island hopping, standardized amphibious doctrine, and logistical pre-positioning. But the cost has been immense. Tens of thousands of casualties, hundreds of ships sunk or damaged, and every mile of advance extends the supply lines further, making the next operation even more complex. In his private moments, Nimitz wonders if there's a better way. Could blockade alone force Japanese surrender without invading the home islands? Could strategic bombing from the Marianas make invasion unnecessary? These questions don't have answers in mid-1944, but they will become critical by mid-1945 when the final decision must be made: invade Japan at catastrophic cost or find an alternative. The man who solved the geography problem of crossing 5,000 miles of ocean will face an even harder problem: how to end a war without destroying the victor in the process. November 20th, 1943. Badio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The first wave of Marines hits the beach at 09:13 hours. Within minutes, the assault transforms into slaughter. The landing craft hang up on a coral reef 500 yards from shore. Marines climb out into chest-deep water and wade toward the beach under withering machine gun fire. Japanese gunners have pre-registered every approach route. Water erupts around the Marines as bullets strike. Men drop and disappear beneath the surface. Bodies float face down in the lagoon. Those who reach the beach find a seawall 4 feet high with no cover beyond it. Japanese pillboxes made from concrete and coconut logs are impervious to naval gunfire. The Marines can't advance and they can't retreat. They can only die. By nightfall on the first day, 1,500 Marines are casualties. The island is 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, the smallest piece of territory Americans have fought for in the Pacific War. And it's costing more lives per square yard than anywhere else on Earth. Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance watches the Tarawa assault from his flagship Indianapolis with growing concern. He commands the 5th Fleet, responsible for all Central Pacific operations. Tarawa was supposed to demonstrate improved amphibious doctrine, better reconnaissance, longer naval bombardment, specialized landing craft. Instead, it's demonstrating how much the Navy still doesn't understand about assaulting fortified positions. The intelligence estimates were catastrophically wrong. Planners predicted 500 Japanese defenders. Tarawa has 4,600, 8 times the estimate. The naval bombardment that lasted 3 hours was supposed to neutralize the defenses. It barely scratched them. The LVT landing craft that were supposed to cross the reef experienced mechanical failures, and no one predicted the tide. The attack was scheduled for high tide to float landing craft over the reef. But the tide is neap, a rare astronomical condition causing lower than normal high tides. The reef is exposed, and Marines are dying because someone didn't check the tide tables carefully enough. Spruance is 57 years old, a cruiser admiral commanding carriers in the largest amphibious operation in Pacific history. His appointment to 5th Fleet Command shocked the Navy's aviator community. Carriers should be commanded by aviators, they argued. But Admiral Nimitz saw qualities in Spruance that transcended aviation expertise: analytical precision, emotional control, and absolute commitment to mission over glory. Spruance graduated from the Naval Academy in 1906, the same year as Nimitz. He spent decades in surface warfare, becoming known as a brilliant tactical calculator who never made impulsive decisions. At Midway, stepping in when Admiral Halsey was hospitalized, Spruance commanded the carrier task force that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. His performance was nearly flawless, aggressive when opportunity presented, cautious when risk exceeded potential gain. After Midway, Nimitz promoted him to command a 5th Fleet despite having never served on an aircraft carrier. The aviators protested. Nimitz didn't care. He needed judgment more than expertise. The Tarawa operation exposes the fundamental tension in Spruance's command philosophy. He prioritizes mission accomplishment over tactical opportunity. When subordinates argue for aggressive pursuit of retreating enemies, Spruance calculates risks versus reward and often chooses caution. This drives aggressive commanders insane. They see opportunities being missed, victories being limited, but Spruance sees something else. The mission is to capture the island and protect the landing force, not to achieve the maximum possible enemy destruction. By the evening of November 23rd, 76 hours after the assault began, Baitio Island is secured. American casualties: 1,590 Marines and 687 Navy personnel killed, 3,779 wounded. Japanese casualties: 4,690 killed, 17 captured. The exchange ratio is terrible, barely more than 2-to-1. But the mission is accomplished. The island is American, and Spruance has learned lessons that will save thousands of lives in future operations. The criticism of Tarawa is immediate and savage. Time magazine publishes photographs of dead Marines floating in the lagoon. Newspapers demand explanations for the casualties. Congress calls for investigations. Admiral Nimitz defends the operation publicly, while privately ordering a comprehensive review of every failure. The review produces a document that will revolutionize amphibious warfare, the Tarawa After Action Report. Every mistake is cataloged. Intelligence failures: improve aerial reconnaissance and develop specialized reef reconnaissance teams. Naval gunfire failures: extend bombardment to days rather than hours and use direct fire from destroyers and close to shore. Landing craft failures: develop more reliable LVTs and provide maintenance training. Tide failures: conduct hydrographic surveys and schedule assaults for specific tide conditions. The report is distributed to every amphibious unit in the Pacific. The lessons paid for in Marine blood at Tarawa will be applied at every subsequent landing, June 15th through July 9th, 1944. The invasion of Saipan represents the culmination of amphibious doctrine improvement. Underwater demolition. Teams survey the beaches for 3 days before the landing. Naval bombardment lasts 72 hours, not 3. 8 battleships fire 24,000 shells at the island. Destroyers move to within 1,000 yards of shore for direct fire missions. Close air support is coordinated by Marine aviators embedded with the assault force. LVT Amtraks are maintained and tested before the operation. The landing is nearly flawless from a tactical perspective, but Saipan also demonstrates a new Japanese defensive doctrine that neutralizes many American advantages. Instead of defending the beaches where naval gunfire can destroy them, the Japanese position forces in the interior where terrain provides cover. Instead of banzai charges, they conduct coordinated counterattacks. Instead of fighting to the death in place, they conduct fighting withdrawals that extend the campaign. The result is the bloodiest battle yet. 3,226 Americans killed, 13,379 wounded over 24 days. While Marines fight on Saipan, the largest carrier battle since Midway develops to the west. Japanese intelligence has detected the American invasion and dispatched the mobile fleet, 9 carriers with 473 aircraft, to destroy the 5th Fleet. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands the Japanese force. He believes his carriers have longer-range aircraft than the Americans, giving him the advantage of striking first while remaining outside American attack range. Admiral Spruance commands the American force, 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers with 956 aircraft. The tactical situation creates a dilemma that will define Spruance's legacy. Should he sail west aggressively to engage the Japanese fleet at maximum range, Or should he remain close to Saipan to protect the invasion force from end-around attacks? June 19th, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japanese aircraft launch at 0830 hours from a position 300 miles west of the American fleet. Spruance's radar operators detect the incoming strike at 150 miles. American fighters launch and establish intercept positions. What follows is later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, poorly trained due to fuel shortages back home, fly into a buzzsaw of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft are destroyed. By day's end, 349 Japanese aircraft have been shot down. American losses are 30 aircraft. 3 Japanese carriers are sunk by submarines. It's a catastrophic defeat for Japanese naval aviation. The Imperial Navy will never again mount a major carrier operation. But the tactical victory is followed by strategic controversy. As Japanese survivors retreat westward, Spruance's staff urges pursuit. The Japanese fleet is crippled and vulnerable. One more strike could destroy it completely. But Spruance calculates the risks. Pursuit would take him away from Saipan, potentially exposing the invasion force to submarines or surviving Japanese surface forces. His mission is to protect the landing, not to achieve maximum destruction of the enemy fleet. He orders limited pursuit, launching strikes on June 20th that sink one carrier and damage others. But he refuses to pursue beyond 200 miles from Saipan. The Japanese fleet escapes. The criticism is immediate. Admiral John Slew McCain, commanding fast carriers, argues that Spruance let the Japanese Navy escape. Admiral King in Washington questions whether Spruance was too cautious. Even some of Spruance's own staff believe he missed an opportunity to end Japanese carrier aviation in one blow. Admiral Nimitz defends Spruance's decision in language that reveals his own command philosophy. In a message to Washington, he writes, Spruance's mission was to capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. His decision to remain in position to protect the landing force was correct. The invasion succeeded. The Japanese fleet was defeated. That is what matters. But privately, Nimitz recognizes the problem. The Pacific War requires 2 types of commanders. Defensive commanders like Spruance who prioritize mission over opportunity, and offensive commanders like Halsey who prioritize destroying the enemy over everything else. Neither approach is universally correct. The solution is to alternate them. Fifth Fleet under Spruance will conduct operations where protecting objectives is paramount. Third Fleet under Halsey will conduct operations where aggressive pursuit is required. Same ships, different commanders, different missions. It's an elegant solution to an impossible problem. The Spruance-Halsey alternation becomes one of Nimitz's most brilliant command innovations. Every major operation uses either Fifth Fleet or Third Fleet, never both simultaneously. While one fleet operates, the other plans the next operation. While Spruance protects the Marianas invasion, Halsey plans the Philippines campaign. While Halsey conducts raids on Japanese shipping, Spruance plans the Iwo Jima assault. The system allows continuous operations without exhausting commanders or staffs. It also confuses Japanese intelligence, which struggles to understand whether Fifth Fleet and Third Fleet are the same force or different forces. Some Japanese intelligence officers conclude that America has 2 massive fleets operating simultaneously, a misperception that contributes to Japanese strategic despair. By August 1944, Spruance has commanded the Fifth Fleet through the capture of the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Mariana Islands. American forces have advanced 3,000 miles across the Central Pacific in 9 months. The casualties are staggering, over 20,000 killed and wounded, but the strategic gains are immense. B-29 bombers based in the Marianas can now strike Tokyo. The Japanese home islands are under attack for the first time since the Doolittle raid. And the Imperial Navy's carrier force has been destroyed. Spruance's contribution to these victories is less visible than Halsey's dramatic raids, but arguably more important. He protects objectives. He accepts missions and accomplishes them regardless of competing opportunities. He calculates risks and refuses to gamble when the stakes are too high. Admiral Nimitz will later write in his official history, Raymond Spruance was the finest fleet commander I ever knew. He had no ego, only judgment. He never sought glory, only mission accomplishment. And when the history of the Pacific War is written, his name will stand beside Halsey's, not because he was aggressive, but because he was right. The distinction matters. Halsey will get the headlines. Spruance will get Nimitz's respect. And in the final campaigns of the war, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Spruance's calculated approach will prove essential when kamikaze attacks make protecting the fleet as important as destroying the enemy. The man who never sought recognition becomes the commander Nimitz trusts most when the stakes are highest. At Tarawa, Spruance learned that amphibious assault is calculated slaughter. At Philippine Sea, he demonstrated that protecting the mission sometimes means letting the enemy escape. And in the brutal campaigns ahead, those lessons will save thousands of American lives while advancing relentlessly toward Japan. Pearl Harbor, December 1st, 1943. A conference room fills with officers who have just witnessed the bloodbath at Tarawa. Admiral Nimitz sits at the head of the table, surrounded by amphibious commanders, Marine generals, naval gunfire officers, and intelligence specialists. The mood is grim. Tarawa cost 1,590 Marine lives to capture an island 2 miles long. If that ratio holds for the rest of the Pacific campaign, American casualties will exceed 500,000 men. The mathematics are unsustainable. Something must change. Nimitz opens the meeting with a statement that shocks some of the officers. Gentlemen, Tarawa was a failure of planning, not a failure of courage. The Marines did their job. We failed them. Now we're going to figure out how we failed and make sure it never happens again. For the next 6 hours, the assembled officers conduct a ruthless autopsy of every mistake made at Tarawa. No one is spared criticism. No assumption is left unchallenged. By the end of the meeting, the framework for modern amphibious warfare doctrine has been established. The first failure identified is intelligence. The pre-assault estimate claimed 500 Japanese defenders occupied Tarawa. The actual number was 4,690. The error wasn't random. It was systematic. American intelligence officers counted visible gun emplacements and extrapolated garrison size. They didn't account for underground bunkers, camouflaged positions, or reinforcements. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the island from above, but revealed nothing about the elaborate system of tunnels and reinforced concrete structures. The solution requires a new capability: close-range hydrographic and obstacle reconnaissance. Commander Draper Kaufman, a demolition expert, proposes creating specialized teams of swimmers who will scout beaches before assaults. These underwater demolition teams, UDTs, will swim ashore at night, map obstacles and defenses, take depth soundings, and withdraw before dawn. The idea is considered insane by some officers. You want men to swim onto enemy-held beaches without weapons? But Nimitz approves the concept immediately. UDT training begins in December 1943. The second failure is naval gunfire. 3 hours of bombardment before the Tarawa assault barely scratched the Japanese defenses. Concrete bunkers reinforced with coconut logs and coral rubble proved nearly impervious to indirect fire from battleships positioned miles offshore. The shells that did hit often penetrated through the roof and exploded inside without collapsing the structure. What's needed is direct fire from close range, shells hitting the bunkers horizontally rather than falling from above. But direct fire requires ships to close to within 1,000 to 2,000 yards of shore, exposing them to coastal artillery. The Navy develops a brutal solution. Old battleships and destroyers will conduct close-range bombardment, accepting damage to knock out fortifications. At Kwajalein in February 1944, battleships Pennsylvania and Colorado position themselves within 2,000 yards and fire point-blank at Japanese positions. Colorado is hit by shore batteries twice, but continues firing. The defenses are demolished. The tactic becomes standard. 3 days of bombardment from long range, followed by close-range direct fire immediately before landing. The third failure is landing craft. At Tarawa, many Higgins boats, standard landing craft, hung up on the coral reef. Marines were forced to wade hundreds of yards under fire. The LVT Amtrak, an amphibious tracked vehicle that can cross reefs, was supposed to solve this problem. But the LVTs used at Tarawa were unreliable. Engines failed, tracks broke, drivers lacked training. The solution requires both improved vehicles and better maintenance. The Navy orders hundreds of new LVT-4 Amtraks with more powerful engines and heavier armor. More importantly, maintenance crews are established at forward bases specifically to service LVTs. Drivers receive weeks of training instead of days. By Saipan in June 1944, LVT reliability exceeds 90%. The Marines can now cross reefs under fire with acceptable casualty rates. The fourth failure is close air support. At Tarawa, carrier aircraft bombed Japanese positions before the assault, but had no way to coordinate with Marines after landing. Ground units couldn't communicate with aircraft. Pilots didn't know where friendly forces were positioned. Bombs often fell on Marines because pilots couldn't distinguish friend from enemy. The solution comes from Marine aviators who propose embedding air liaison officers with assault units. These officers, equipped with radio sets, will direct airstrikes from the ground. The system is tested at Kwajalein and proves revolutionary. A Marine unit pinned down by a pillbox radios for air support. Within minutes, Hellcat fighters appear overhead. The air liaison officer talks them onto the target. Bombs hit within 50 yards of the requesting unit. The pillbox is destroyed. Close air support transitions from area bombardment to precision strikes. By Peleliu in September 1944, air liaison officers are standard in every battalion. But the most important lesson from Tarawa is psychological. The Japanese will defend to the death. Of 4,690 Japanese troops on Betio Island, only 17 were captured alive. The rest fought until killed. This is not a cultural peculiarity. It's a deliberate tactical doctrine. Japanese military training emphasizes death before surrender. Officers execute soldiers who attempt to surrender. Wounded Japanese soldiers feign death and then attack corpsmen treating them. Artillery observers remain in their posts, radioing coordinates, even as Marines close on their position. The implications are stark. There will be no negotiated surrenders. No large-scale capitulations, no collapse of enemy morale. Every fortified position must be destroyed. Every defender must be killed. The only question is how efficiently this can be accomplished. The evolution of defensive tactics also emerges from captured Japanese documents and prisoner interrogations. At Tarawa, the Japanese defended the beaches, making them vulnerable to naval gunfire. By Peleliu in September 1944, they have shifted to defense in depth. Positions are located inland where terrain provides cover. Interconnected caves and tunnels allow defenders to retreat and reoccupy positions. Rather than banzai charges that waste lives, Japanese forces conduct coordinated withdrawals and counterattacks. The new doctrine turns every island into a killing ground, where Americans must advance yard by yard under constant fire. Major General Roy Geiger, commanding the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps at Peleliu, reports that Japanese defenses are the most sophisticated yet encountered. The island was estimated to fall in 4 days. It takes 2 months. The Peleliu campaign illustrates both the progress and the limitations of improved doctrine. UDTs survey the beaches and provide accurate intelligence. Naval bombardment lasts 3 days. LVTs cross the reef successfully. Close air support is responsive and accurate. The landing is nearly perfect, but the inland fighting is a nightmare. Japanese defenders occupy coral ridges honeycombed with caves. Flamethrowers and demolition charges are required to clear each position. Casualties mount relentlessly. 1,800 Americans killed, 8,000 wounded. The island has no strategic value. It was supposed to protect MacArthur's flank for the Philippines invasion. But the Philippines invasion succeeds without Peleliu playing any role. Admiral Halsey will later argue that Peleliu shouldn't have been assaulted at all. Nimitz, reviewing the casualty reports, is forced to agree. The doctrine continues evolving through the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, naval bombardment lasts 4 days. UDTs map every beach obstacle. LVTs are supplemented with armored amphibians mounting 75mm guns. Close air support includes napalm, jellied gasoline that burns through cave systems. Casualties are still horrific. 6,821 Americans killed, 21,065 wounded. But the island falls in 36 days. Brutal, but faster than previous assaults of similar size. At Okinawa in April through June 1945, the Doctrine reaches its fullest development. Bombardment lasts 7 days. UDTs clear beach obstacles under covering fire from destroyers. The landing involves 545,000 troops, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Close air support flies over 3,000 sorties per day. Yet, Okinawa also demonstrates the limits of Doctrine when the enemy adapts. Japanese forces on Okinawa implement the most sophisticated defensive plan of the war. The coastline is lightly defended. Major forces are positioned in the interior behind fortified lines. Rather than attempting to stop the landing, the Japanese plan to bleed American forces in prolonged combat. The strategy works. The Okinawa campaign lasts 82 days. American casualties? 12,520 killed, 38,000 wounded. Navy casualties from kamikaze attacks add another 5,000 killed and another 4,800 wounded. The total American casualty count, 61,000, exceeds the garrison that defended Okinawa. For the first time in the Pacific War, American casualties in capturing a position exceed enemy casualties in defending it. Admiral Nimitz reviews the Okinawa casualties with a growing sense of dread. If Okinawa costs 61,000 casualties, what will invading Japan's home islands cost? The preliminary estimates for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, project over 400,000 American casualties in the first phase alone. The improved amphibious doctrine reduces casualties per landing, but can't eliminate them. And the Japanese are learning faster than Americans are improving. Every campaign teaches the Japanese how to make the next one bloodier. By mid-1945, Nimitz privately believes that amphibious assault alone cannot win the war at acceptable cost. Alternative strategies, blockade, bombardment, perhaps even new weapons, must be considered, but those decisions will come later. For now, in the summer of 1945, the amphibious warfare doctrine pioneered at Tarawa and refined through blood across the Pacific represents humanity's most effective method of projecting power from sea to land. The doctrine will be studied by militaries worldwide for decades. Every modern amphibious assault, Korea, Suez, Falklands, Gulf War, will draw on lessons learned in the Pacific. But those future applications are for peacetime study. In 1945, the doctrine is simply the least bad method of accomplishing a necessary mission. Every landing costs thousands of lives. Every improvement saves hundreds. And the man responsible for transforming disaster into doctrine is an admiral who understands that learning from failure is more important than avoiding it. Nimitz's willingness to conduct ruthless self-criticism after Tarawa, to acknowledge mistakes publicly, and to implement systematic improvements creates a learning organization that adapts faster than the enemy. It's not glorious, it's not dramatic, it's just relentlessly effective. And in a war where efficiency is measured in lives saved, effectiveness is the only virtue that matters. Brisbane, Australia, March 26, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur boards his personal transport aircraft, a C-54 named Baton, for the flight to Pearl Harbor. It's his first meeting with Admiral Chester Nimitz since both men assumed command of their respective theaters over 2 years ago. MacArthur is 64 years old, the most famous American general since Ulysses Grant, a man who believes history has chosen him to liberate the Philippines and redeem his promise, "I shall return." Nimitz is 59, largely unknown to the American public, a man who believes strategic efficiency matters more than dramatic gestures. The two commanders control separate theaters with separate commands, answering only to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. They should have cooperated from the beginning. Instead, they've spent 2 years conducting separate campaigns, competing for resources, and barely communicating. The meeting in Pearl Harbor will either produce coordination or confirm that the Pacific War is being fought by two armies that happen to be on the same side. The command structure that created this dysfunction was designed in Washington during the desperate months after Pearl Harbor. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, insisted that an Army general command the theater that would ultimately require ground combat to defeat Japan. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, insisted that a Navy admiral command the naval forces that would dominate the Pacific. Neither would accept subordination to the other service. The compromise divided the Pacific into two commands. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area included Australia, New Guinea, the Netherlands East Indies, and the Philippines. Nimitz's Pacific Ocean areas included everything else: the Central Pacific, North Pacific, and South Pacific. The boundary between commands ran through the Solomon Islands, creating absurd situations where one island might be in MacArthur's command, and the next island over in Nimitz's command. It was a structure designed to avoid political conflict in Washington. It guaranteed strategic confusion in the Pacific. MacArthur's strategy for defeating Japan is conceptually simple and emotionally powerful. Advance from Australia through New Guinea to the Philippines, then use the Philippines as a base to invade Japan. The Philippines are critical, not just strategically, but personally. MacArthur commanded U.S. and Filipino forces when the Japanese invaded in December 1941. Roosevelt ordered him to evacuate to Australia rather than be captured. MacArthur left behind thousands of American and Filipino troops who were forced to surrender on Bataan and Corregidor. His promise to return has become his defining statement. To MacArthur, bypassing the Philippines is inconceivable, morally, politically, and strategically. The Filipinos remained loyal to America. Americans have a moral obligation to liberate them. Additionally, the Philippines control the sea lanes between Japan and its conquered territories. Control the Philippines and Japan is cut off from oil, rubber, and other resources. Nimitz's strategy is different and more coldly logical. Advance through the Central Pacific, capturing islands that can serve as air bases and anchorages, bypass strong points that aren't strategically necessary, and approach Japan via the Marianas. From the Marianas, B-29 bombers can reach Tokyo. From the Marianas, the fleet can sortie to cut Japanese supply lines. The Philippines can be bypassed entirely. Yes, American and Filipino prisoners are suffering in Japanese camps. Yes, MacArthur promised to return. But wars are won by strategic efficiency, not by redeeming promises. Every month spent liberating the Philippines is a month that could be spent bombing Japan into submission. Nimitz's staff estimates that bypassing the Philippines would shorten the war by 6 months and save 50,000 American lives. But they also understand that this is a political calculation beyond their authority. The meeting at Pearl Harbor begins cordially and deteriorates rapidly. MacArthur arrives with detailed maps showing his proposed advance through the Philippines. He argues that the Philippines are the strategic key to victory. Bypassing them would leave MacArthur's flank exposed and allow Japan to reinforce its home islands. He emphasizes the moral obligation to the Filipino people and the political impossibility of abandoning them. Nimitz's staff presents the alternative: advance through the Central Pacific to Formosa, bypassing the Philippines entirely. From Formosa, American forces would be closer to Japan and could interdict all shipping between Japan and Southeast Asia. MacArthur dismisses the plan as naval parochialism. The Navy wants to fight its own war without Army participation. Nimitz counters that the Philippines operation would require committing the fleet to confined waters near Japan's air bases, risking another Savo Island. The argument becomes heated. Neither commander will concede. The deadlock persists for 3 days. MacArthur threatens to appeal directly to Roosevelt. Nimitz points out that the Joint Chiefs have assigned operational decisions to theater commanders, not politicians. The breakthrough comes when MacArthur makes a tactical compromise. He'll modify his Philippines plan to focus on Leyte, the central island, rather than Luzon in the north. This reduces the operational scope and allows Nimitz's fleet to provide support without being tied down indefinitely. Nimitz agrees to provide naval support for the Leyte operation if MacArthur agrees not to oppose Central Pacific operations toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The compromise is brokered by Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, who has flown to Hawaii specifically to mediate. Neither commander is satisfied, but both recognize that continued deadlock serves only the Japanese. July 1944, Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt arrives aboard the heavy cruiser USS Baltimore for a conference with his Pacific commanders. Roosevelt is in the fourth year of his unprecedented third term and planning to run for a fourth. The war is going well in Europe. Rome has fallen. The Normandy invasion succeeded. But the Pacific campaign is consuming resources and producing steady casualties with no end in sight. Roosevelt needs a strategy that wins the war decisively, but doesn't drag on past the November election. MacArthur and Nimitz present their competing strategies. MacArthur speaks for 90 minutes, using maps and photographs to illustrate the moral necessity and strategic wisdom of liberating the Philippines. Nimitz speaks for 30 minutes, presenting the staff analysis showing that Formosa offers faster victory at lower cost. Roosevelt listens carefully, asks questions, but makes no decision at the meeting. The decision, when it comes, is political as much as military. In September 1944, Roosevelt authorizes both strategies. MacArthur will liberate the Philippines. Nimitz will capture Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The dual advance will continue, consuming more resources, but supposedly keeping the Japanese off balance. In practice, the decision means that the Pacific War will be fought on two fronts with insufficient coordination. When MacArthur lands at Leyte in October 1944, photographers capture him wading ashore, a carefully staged image that becomes one of the war's most iconic photographs. The caption reads, "I have returned." MacArthur achieves his personal redemption. Nimitz's fleet provides the naval gunfire and air support that makes the landing possible, but his role is invisible to the public. MacArthur gets the headlines. Nimitz gets the casualties. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 illustrates the complexity of coordinated operations between separate commands. MacArthur has landed on Leyte and requires naval protection. Nimitz's Third Fleet under Admiral Halsey is responsible for protecting the landing. The Japanese, recognizing that losing the Philippines means losing the war, commit their remaining naval forces to a desperate operation. Lure Halsey's carriers north with decoy carriers, while battleships approach Leyte from the west and south to destroy the invasion fleet. The plan almost works. Halsey takes the bait and sails north, chasing Japanese carriers. The Japanese battleship force breaks through into Leyte Gulf and encounters only escort carriers and destroyers, sacrificial lambs that aren't supposed to fight battleships. In the desperate battle off Samar, the escorts fight suicidally to delay the Japanese. Miraculously, the Japanese commander loses his nerve and retreats. MacArthur's invasion is saved by luck and the courage of destroyer crews, not by strategic coordination. The recriminations after Leyte Gulf are savage. Halsey is accused of abandoning his mission to chase glory. He defends himself by noting that his orders were ambiguous. Was he supposed to protect MacArthur's landing or destroy the Japanese fleet? Both missions are important, but they are contradictory. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing the after-action reports, recognizes the systemic problem. Split command creates split responsibility. Halsey was trying to serve two masters, support MacArthur's ground campaign, and conduct independent naval operations. The confusion nearly resulted in disaster. But rather than relitigate the battle, Nimitz focuses on preventing similar confusion in the future. He issues new operational guidelines. When the fleet is supporting ground operations, protection of the landing force is the primary mission, destruction of enemy forces is secondary. It's the same principle Spruance applied at Philippine Sea. Mission before opportunity. By December 1944, MacArthur's campaign in the Philippines is bogging down in brutal fighting. Leyte was supposed to fall in weeks. It takes months. Casualties mount. 3,500 Americans killed, 12,000 wounded, just on Leyte alone. MacArthur decides to invade Luzon in January 1945, requiring another massive amphibious assault supported by Nimitz's fleet. Meanwhile, Nimitz's campaign is advancing toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, requiring those same fleet assets. The Joint Chiefs are forced to arbitrate resource allocation, carriers to support MacArthur's Luzon landing, then shift to Nimitz for Iwo Jima, then back to MacArthur for southern Philippines operations, then to Nimitz for Okinawa. The fleet spends as much time transiting between theaters as conducting operations. Admiral Nimitz maintains public courtesy toward MacArthur while privately expressing frustration to his staff. In a letter to Admiral King, he writes, "The dual command structure serves political necessity, but creates operational inefficiency. We are fighting two wars when we should be fighting one." But Nimitz also recognizes that MacArthur's Philippines campaign serves strategic purposes beyond MacArthur's ego. The Japanese commit massive forces to defend the Philippines, forces that won't be available to defend Iwo Jima or Okinawa. By liberating the Philippines, MacArthur is drawing Japanese attention away from the Central Pacific. Whether this was intentional strategy or fortunate side effect, Nimitz can't be sure, but he's pragmatic enough to accept benefits regardless of their source. The ultimate assessment of the dual command structure must wait until after the war. In his memoirs, Nimitz writes diplomatically, "General MacArthur was a brilliant strategist whose Philippines campaign achieved its objectives. Whether those objectives were worth the cost is a question for historians, not commanders." The statement reveals Nimitz's fundamental disagreement without explicitly criticizing MacArthur. Privately, Nimitz believes the Philippines campaign extended the war by 4 to 6 months and cost 50,000 additional American casualties. But he also recognizes that military strategy cannot ignore political reality. Roosevelt needed MacArthur's public support. MacArthur needed the Philippines' liberation to vindicate his career. Nimitz provided the naval support to make it possible while simultaneously advancing his own Central Pacific campaign. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. By August 1945, when Japan surrenders, the question of command structure becomes moot. MacArthur is designated Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, responsible for the occupation of Japan. Nimitz retains command of the Pacific Fleet. The rivalry is resolved by victory. But the lessons remain. Unified command is militarily superior to split command. Political considerations sometimes override military efficiency. And winning despite dysfunction is still winning. Admiral Nimitz learned to navigate MacArthur's ego, Washington's politics, and strategic reality simultaneously. It's a lesson in leadership that transcends military doctrine. Sometimes you can't fix the system, so you learn to succeed within its constraints. The man who mastered that lesson is the man who won the Pacific War, not despite MacArthur's shadow, but alongside it. October the 23rd, 1944, Philippine Sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands on the bridge of the carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack. Below decks, the carrier's hangar contains exactly 76 aircraft, less than half the normal complement. The pilots flying those aircraft have an average of 3 months training. Their predecessors, the elite carrier pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific for 6 months, are dead. Fuel shortages have cut training programs from hundreds of hours to dozens. The pilots barely know how to take off and land. Ozawa's mission is to use these inadequate forces as bait to lure American carriers away from Leyte Gulf so that Japanese battleships can destroy MacArthur's invasion fleet. It's a suicide mission, dressed up as strategy. The Imperial Navy is about to commit its last operational forces to a desperate gamble that will almost certainly end in annihilation. But Japan has run out of alternatives. If the Philippines fall, Japan loses access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. Without oil, the war is lost. So Japan is betting everything on one last throw of the dice. The Japanese plan is called Shogo, Victory Operation, a name that reflects desperation rather than confidence. The operation is insanely complex, requiring coordination between 4 separate forces across thousands of miles of ocean. Admiral Ozawa's carrier force will approach from the north, deliberately making itself visible to American reconnaissance to lure Admiral Halsey's carriers away from Leyte. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 5 battleships including the super battleship Yamato, and 12 cruisers will transit San Bernardino Strait and enter Leyte Gulf from the north. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force, 2 battleships and 4 destroyers, will transit Surigao Strait and enter Leyte Gulf from the south. The two forces will converge on the invasion fleet from opposite directions, catching it in a pincer. The plan requires precise timing, radio silence to avoid detection, and American carriers being out of position. If any element fails, the entire operation collapses. October 24th. The Sibuyan Sea. Kurita's center force is detected by American submarines as it transits towards San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Halsey orders airstrikes from his carriers. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attack the Japanese fleet. The super battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, and the second-largest warship ever built, becomes the focus of American attacks. 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs hit Musashi over 5 hours. The great ship staggers under the onslaught, her speed dropping, her hull settling lower in the water. By evening, Musashi capsizes and sinks, taking over 1,000 sailors with her. But Musashi's sacrifice allows the rest of Kurita's force to survive, with lighter damage. Yamato takes 2 bomb hits. Several cruisers are hit, but the fleet remains operational and continues towards San Bernardino Strait. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the north, Admiral Ozawa's carriers make themselves visible to American reconnaissance. Halsey receives reports of Japanese carriers approaching from the north. This is the moment Halsey has waited for, a chance to destroy the remaining Japanese carrier force. Intelligence reports suggest the carriers are at reduced strength, possibly without many aircraft, but Halsey doesn't know their decoys. He believes he's facing a genuine threat that must be eliminated. More importantly, Halsey's operational philosophy is to destroy enemy forces, not to protect convoys. When given the choice between defense and offense, Halsey chooses offense every time. At 800 hours on October 24th, he orders 3rd Fleet to pursue north. All 6 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers under his command steam away from Leyte Gulf, chasing Ozawa's decoys. San Bernardino Strait is left unguarded. That night, Kurita's center force transits San Bernardino Strait unopposed. No American ships patrol the exit. No aircraft monitor the strait. Kurita can barely believe his fortune. The strait is the choke point where Japanese battleships would be most vulnerable to ambush. But it's empty. 3rd Fleet has gone north. Kurita's battleships emerge into the Philippine Sea and turn south toward Leyte Gulf. Simultaneously, Nishimura's southern force enters Surigao Strait from the south. This time, the Americans are waiting. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf has positioned 6 battleships across the northern exit of the strait in a classic crossing the T formation. The battleships can fire full broadsides, while the Japanese can only fire their forward guns. It's the naval battle that War Plan Orange predicted, 20 years too late to matter. American battleships, including survivors of Pearl Harbor, obliterate the southern force. Nishimura's flagship is sunk. He goes down with his ship. Only 1 Japanese destroyer escapes. October 25th, dawn, off Samar Island. Kurita's center force stumbles upon Task Unit 77.4.3, 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The escort carriers are small, slow ships designed to provide air support for ground troops. Their aircraft are loaded with bombs for ground support missions, not torpedoes for attacking ships. The destroyers are small vessels meant for submarine defense, not fleet actions. They're not supposed to fight battleships. Sprague immediately realizes his force is doomed. The Japanese battleships have 18-inch guns that outrange anything the Americans possess. The American ships can't outrun Japanese battleships. There's no retreat, no escape. Sprague orders his destroyers to attack suicidally, while the escort carriers run. What follows is one of the most desperate naval actions in history. The destroyers USS Johnston, USS Hole, and USS Heermann charge directly at the Japanese battleship column, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. Johnston closes to within 5,000 yards of Yamato and fires a full salvo. Yamato takes evasive action, breaking the Japanese formation. Japanese cruisers turn their guns on Johnston, hitting her repeatedly. Johnston loses power, loses steering, but continues firing with her remaining gun. Commander Ernest Evans, Johnston's captain, stands on the bridge even after being wounded, directing fire manually after the fire control is destroyed. Johnston sinks at 09:45, taking Evans and half her crew with her. Hole and Heerman are similarly savaged, but continue attacking, buying time for the carriers. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, a vessel so small it's nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, charges into the battle and engages a cruiser at suicidal close range before being sunk. While the destroyers sacrifice themselves, the escort carriers launch every available aircraft. Pilots take off with whatever ordnance is loaded: bombs, depth charges, sometimes nothing at all. They make dry runs on Japanese ships, trying to distract the gunners and disrupt targeting. When they run out of ammunition, they make dummy attacks to force the Japanese ships to maneuver. Pilots jettison depth charges, useless against surface ships, onto Japanese cruisers just to cause splashes that might obscure vision. It's futile and magnificent. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay is hit repeatedly and sinks. The carrier USS St. Lo is hit by a Japanese aircraft in what appears to be a deliberate suicide attack, the first organized kamikaze strike. St. Lo explodes and sinks in minutes, and then, inexplicably, at 09:20, Admiral Kurita orders his fleet to break off the action and retreat. The Japanese battleships are on the verge of annihilating the American force. Leyte Gulf is open before them. MacArthur's invasion fleet is vulnerable. Victory is within reach. But Kurita believes he's facing fleet carriers, not escort carriers. He thinks American battleships are approaching from the south. They're not. He's concerned about fuel. He's concerned about air attacks. He's exhausted from 3 days of continuous combat. He makes a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He retreats. Sprague's force, battered and bloodied, survives. MacArthur's invasion is saved. The battle is over. To the north, Halsey's carriers find Ozawa's decoy force and destroy it. All 4 Japanese carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, are sunk. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft are destroyed. Ozawa's mission is accomplished. He lured Halsey away and sacrificed his carriers to give Kurita a chance. But Kurita retreated, rendering Ozawa's sacrifice meaningless. When Halsey receives frantic messages from Sprague describing the battle off Samar, he realizes he's been deceived. He turns south, but it's too late. By the time Third Fleet arrives, Kurita has retreated through San Bernardino Strait. The opportunity to destroy the center force is lost. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, actually 4 separate battles over 3 days, is the largest naval engagement in history. 200,000 personnel, 282 ships involved. The Japanese lose 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses are 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The exchange ratio is catastrophic for Japan. More importantly, the Imperial Navy ceases to exist as a fighting force. The surviving ships lack fuel to operate. The pilots are dead. The strategic situation is irreversible. But the battle also reveals American vulnerabilities. Halsey's decision to chase the decoy force nearly resulted in disaster. Only the incredible courage of destroyer and escort carrier crews, combined with Kurita's inexplicable retreat, saved MacArthur's invasion. Admiral Nimitz, reading the after-action reports at Pearl Harbor, recognizes the battle's significance immediately. This is the end of Japanese naval power. Future operations won't face meaningful naval opposition, but he's troubled by the command confusion that nearly led to catastrophe. He sends a message to Halsey that becomes famous. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. The message is intended as an operational query. Where is the battleship force Halsey was supposed to position at San Bernardino Strait? But radio padding added by communications officers transforms it into apparent criticism. Halsey, reading the message, is enraged. Relations between Halsey and Pearl Harbor headquarters become strained. Nimitz later apologizes for the communications confusion, but the strategic question remains. Did Halsey make the right decision pursuing the carriers? The historical debate continues decades after the war. Halsey's defenders argue he destroyed the Japanese carrier force, achieving a strategic objective. His critics argue he abandoned his primary mission, protecting the invasion, to pursue glory. Nimitz's official assessment is diplomatically neutral. Admiral Halsey's aggressive spirit contributed to many victories in the Pacific War. At Leyte Gulf, that aggressiveness was exploited by a clever enemy plan. The battle was won despite tactical errors, not because of tactical perfection. But privately, Nimitz makes a notation in Halsey's personnel file. Future operations requiring protection of objectives should go to Spruance. The alternation between 3rd Fleet and 5th Fleet isn't just about planning cycles. It's about matching commander temperament to mission requirements. For Japan, Leyte Gulf marks the end of conventional naval warfare. The fleet is destroyed. Replacement ships can't be built. Replacement pilots can't be trained. Oil-to-fuel operations doesn't exist. But the Navy's destruction doesn't mean Japan's surrender. The military still controls vast armies. The home islands are fortified. And a new weapon is about to debut, the kamikaze. If conventional forces can't stop American advances, perhaps suicide attacks can. The desperation that sent Kurita's battleships into Leyte Gulf will soon send thousands of pilots diving into American ships. The Imperial Navy is dead. But the war is far from over. November 25, 1944. Off Leyte Gulf. The escort carrier USS St. Lo is conducting routine flight operations when lookouts spot a single Japanese aircraft diving at high speed directly toward the ship. Anti-aircraft gunners open fire. The aircraft is hit multiple times but doesn't break off. It doesn't attempt evasive maneuvers. It doesn't drop bombs. It simply keeps diving. At 10:53 hours, the aircraft crashes through St. Lo's flight deck and explodes in the hangar bay. Secondary explosions from stored ammunition and aviation fuel tear through the ship. Within 27 minutes, St. Lo capsizes and sinks. 113 sailors die. The survivors float in the water, stunned not just by the sinking, but by what they've witnessed, a deliberate suicide attack. The pilot had no intention of surviving. His aircraft was a manned missile. And this isn't an isolated incident. Over the past few days, multiple ships have been hit by similar attacks. The Imperial Japanese Navy has created an official suicide corps, the Kamikaze Special Attack Units. From this day forward, the Pacific War will be fought under the shadow of men willing, compelled, to die in order to kill. The kamikaze concept emerged from desperation and calculation. By late 1944, Japan's conventional air power is shattered. Most experienced pilots are dead. The replacement pilots completing training have a few dozen hours of flight time, enough to take off and navigate, but not enough to conduct effective combat operations against American fighters. In conventional air combat, these novice pilots are slaughtered. But what if the mission didn't require dogfighting or precision bombing? What if the pilot just had to point his aircraft at a target and dive? That mission requires minimal skill. And if the pilot accepts that he'll die in the attack, the aircraft can be loaded with extra explosives and fuel, maximizing damage. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, formalizes this logic into Doctrine. He forms the first official kamikaze unit in October 1944. Volunteers, though how voluntary the volunteering actually is, remains debated, are organized into special attack squadrons. Their mission is simple: one pilot, one ship. The psychological impact of kamikazes on American sailors is immediate and profound. Conventional air attacks can be defeated through fighter interception, anti-aircraft fire, and evasive maneuvering. The attacking pilot wants to survive, so he'll break off if the defenses are too strong. But kamikaze pilots don't break off. They keep coming until they hit or they're destroyed. Even if anti-aircraft fire damages the aircraft, even if the pilot is killed in the cockpit, the aircraft's momentum carries it toward the target. The only way to stop a kamikaze is to completely destroy the aircraft before it reaches the ship. A difficult feat when the aircraft is diving at 300 miles per hour from 15,000 feet. Sailors watch helplessly as aircraft plunge toward them, firing every weapon available, but knowing that one hit will probably get through. The psychological strain is unbearable. Men who survived battles against conventional forces crack under kamikaze attacks. January 6, 1945, Lingayen Gulf, Philippines. The invasion convoy supporting MacArthur's Luzon landing comes under the heaviest kamikaze attack yet launched. Over 50 suicide aircraft attack the fleet throughout the day. The escort carrier USS Omni Bay is hit by a kamikaze carrying a 500-pound bomb. The explosion and fire kill 93 sailors and forces abandonment. The battleship USS New Mexico is hit, killing 29, including her commanding officer and Winston Churchill's personal liaison to MacArthur. The cruiser USS Louisville is hit. The destroyer USS Walkie is sunk. By evening, 25 ships have been hit. Over 200 sailors are dead. The kamikazes achieved in one day what conventional attacks failed to do in months. They made American sailors fear Japanese air power again. The Navy implements countermeasures as fast as they can be developed. Fighter patrols are increased. Radar picket destroyers are positioned far from the fleet to provide early warning, though this makes the destroyers themselves primary targets. Anti-aircraft guns are upgraded with proximity-fused shells that explode near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits. Ships are painted in dazzle camouflage to make range estimation difficult. Combat air patrol procedures are refined to intercept raids before they reach the fleet. But none of these measures can prevent all attacks. The mathematics are brutal. If Japan launches 100 kamikazes and 95 are shot down, 5 still get through. And 5 hits can sink multiple ships. April through June, 1945. Okinawa, the largest kamikaze campaign of the war, unfolds as Japan defends the Ryukyu Islands. Over 1,900 kamikaze sorties are launched in 10 major attack waves called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. The attacks focus on the radar picket destroyers stationed around Okinawa to provide early warning. These destroyers, isolated and easily found, are savaged. USS Laffey is hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs in 80 minutes, but survives. USS Maynard L. Abele is hit by a kamikaze and then by a rocket-powered bomb, an Oka manned missile, and sinks in 4 minutes. USS Callahan is hit and sinks. USS Drexler is hit and sinks. USS William D. Porter is near missed by a kamikaze that dives into the water next to the ship. The underwater explosion ruptures the hull and the ship sinks. 15 destroyers and destroyer escorts are sunk at Okinawa. Over 100 more are damaged. Casualties among the picket ships exceed 50%. The larger ships aren't immune. The carrier USS Bunker Hill is hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11th. The first aircraft crashes into the flight deck, exploding among aircraft being armed for launch. The second hits 30 seconds later, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay. Fires rage through the ship. Ammunition explodes. Aviation fuel ignites. The crew fights for hours to save her, dumping burning aircraft over the side, flooding magazines, and establishing bucket brigades when firefighting equipment is destroyed. Bunker Hill survives, but with 389 dead and 264 wounded. She's so heavily damaged she'll never return to combat. The carrier USS Enterprise, the most decorated ship in the Navy, survivor of every major battle since Pearl Harbor, is hit on May 14th. The kamikaze penetrates the flight deck and explodes, killing 14. Enterprise survives but is sent back to the United States for repairs. The casualty statistics from Okinawa are staggering and unprecedented. Over 4,800 Navy personnel killed, 4,824 wounded. This is more than twice the Marine casualties on the island. For the first time in the Pacific War, Navy casualties exceed ground force casualties in a campaign. The kamikaze threat is so severe that Admiral Nimitz implements rotation policies to prevent psychological breakdown. Ships that sustain heavy attacks are relieved from picket duty after short periods. Crew members showing signs of combat fatigue are transferred. But there aren't enough ships or men to fully implement the policy. Some destroyers serve on picket duty for weeks, their crews exhausted and traumatized, knowing each day might be their last. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces at Okinawa, sends a message to Nimitz that captures the desperation. The kamikaze attacks are the most effective Japanese weapon encountered in the war. If they can sustain this intensity, we cannot continue operations at acceptable cost. Nimitz forwards the message to Admiral King in Washington with his own assessment. The kamikaze threat is critical. Recommend accelerating investigation of alternative strategies to bring about Japanese surrender without continued exposure to suicide attacks. The message is carefully worded, but the implication is clear. Invasion of the Japanese home islands, where kamikaze attacks will be even more intense, might not be possible. Intelligence estimates of Japanese kamikaze capabilities are sobering. The Japanese have approximately 10,500 aircraft reserved for homeland defense. Many are trainers and obsolete types, but all can be converted to kamikazes. Japanese doctrine calls for massed attacks of hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. Overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers. Project estimates suggest that an invasion of Kyushu could face 3,000 kamikaze sorties in the first week, with a 10% hit rate, conservative based on Okinawa experience. That's 300 ships hit. The invasion fleet doesn't have enough ships to sustain those losses and continue operations. Either the kamikaze threat must be eliminated before invasion, requiring destruction of Japanese airfields and aircraft, a campaign lasting months, or an alternative to invasion must be found. The human dimension of the kamikaze threat extends beyond casualties to psychological trauma. Sailors develop what will later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. They flinch at the sound of aircraft engines. They can't sleep because closing their eyes brings visions of aircraft diving at their ship. They develop survivor's guilt when friends die while they live. The Navy has no systematic treatment for combat fatigue. Men showing symptoms are often simply transferred to non-combat duties or sent home without follow-up. Decades after the war, veterans will still wake up screaming from nightmares of kamikazes. The psychological casualties of the kamikaze campaign vastly exceed the physical casualties, though they are never counted in official statistics. By late June 1945, as Okinawa is secured, Admiral Nimitz faces the hardest strategic assessment of his career. Okinawa cost 61,000 American casualties, 12,520 dead, 48,000 wounded. The ratio of American to Japanese casualties is nearly 1-to-1, catastrophic by Pacific War standards. If Okinawa is the preview of invading Japan, the projected casualties for Operation Downfall are understated. The Joint Chiefs estimate 400,000 to 800,000 American casualties in the first phase. Some planners privately suggest casualties could exceed 1 million. The kamikaze threat alone could account for 50,000 Navy casualties. The mathematical reality is unavoidable. Invasion of Japan at Okinawa-level casualty rates is unsustainable. Admiral Nimitz begins advocating for alternatives to invasion. Blockade could starve Japan into surrender. American submarines have already destroyed 60% of Japanese merchant shipping. Continued submarine operations combined with aerial mining of Japanese ports could make importation of food and fuel impossible. Strategic bombing from the Marianas is destroying Japanese cities at an accelerating rate. Perhaps Japan can be bombed into submission. But both strategies, blockade and bombing, require time, possibly years, and they guarantee continued suffering for Allied prisoners of war and occupied populations. There are no good options, only less bad ones. The kamikaze campaign has achieved what Japanese conventional forces could not. It has made America question whether victory is worth the cost. In his private diary, Nimitz writes, "We are winning this war, but winning feels like losing." Washington, D.C., June 18, 1945. In a secure conference room at the White House, President Harry Truman convenes a meeting of his senior military advisors. Truman has been president for only 2 months, elevated from vice president when Roosevelt died in April. He's an artillery captain from World War I, a former senator, a man thrust into the presidency during the final months of a global war. Germany surrendered 5 weeks ago. Japan is the last enemy standing. The question before Truman is binary and terrible. How do we end this war? The military presents 2 options. Admiral William Leahy, Chief of Staff to the President, summarizes, "Mr. President, We can invade Japan at catastrophic cost, or we can blockade Japan indefinitely while bombing continues. There may be a third option, but it's not yet proven. The third option is so secret that even in this room, among men with highest clearances, it's referred to only as the Manhattan Project. Admiral Chester Nimitz, present via secure communications link from Pearl Harbor, is about to brief on Option 1, Invasion. Operation Downfall is the code name for invading Japan. It consists of two phases. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1st, 1945, and Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu, scheduled for March 1st, 1946. Olympic will be the largest amphibious operation in history, dwarfing Normandy. 14 Army and Marine divisions, 767,000 troops, will assault Kyushu from beaches on the southern and western coasts. The landing will be supported by 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, and over 400 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Over 3,000 landing craft will ferry troops ashore. The objective is to capture airfields in southern Kyushu to support the subsequent invasion of Honshu. Coronet, if it becomes necessary, will involve 25 divisions, over 1 million troops, assaulting the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. The combined operations represent the largest military undertaking in human history. The casualty estimates are where the briefing becomes grim. General George Marshall presents the Army's analysis. Japanese forces on Kyushu number approximately 900,000 troops, with another 2 million in training or labor battalions. The terrain favors defense, mountainous, heavily forested, with limited invasion beaches. Japanese defensive doctrine, refined through campaigns at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, emphasizes defense in depth, fortified positions in the interior, and attrition through sustained combat. Marshall's staff estimates 105,000 American casualties in the first 90 days of Olympic, 31,050 killed, the rest wounded. Coronet estimates are even higher, 280,000 casualties in the first 90 days. The total for downfall, over 500,000 American casualties in the first 6 months. And these estimates assume conventional defense only. Admiral Nimitz presents the Navy's assessment of the kamikaze threat. Japanese planners expect invasion and have reserved 10,500 aircraft specifically for homeland defense. These aren't conventional aircraft, they're kamikazes waiting to be launched. Additionally, Japan has built thousands of suicide boats, manned torpedoes called Kaiten, and even suicide submersibles. The plan is to throw everything at the invasion fleet in the first days of Olympic, attempting to sink transports before troops can land, and destroyers before they can provide fire support. The Navy estimates that 30 to 40% of kamikaze attacks will successfully hit targets, higher than at Okinawa because the distances are shorter and the target concentration is greater. Conservative projections: 500 ships hit, 200 sunk. Casualties from naval losses alone could exceed 50,000, and the attacks will continue throughout the campaign. Some staff officers privately estimate total Navy casualties could reach 80,000. The alternative to invasion is blockade and bombardment. Admiral King presents this strategy. American submarines have already destroyed most of Japanese merchant shipping. Aerial mining of Japanese ports and inland waterways can make what little shipping remains inoperable. Strategic bombing from the Marianas is destroying Japanese cities systematically. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the bomber offensive, reports that his B-29s can destroy every major city in Japan within 6 months. Combined with blockade, this will starve Japan's war economy. Without food imports, without fuel, without raw materials, Japanese industry will collapse and the population will face starvation. Japan will be forced to surrender without invasion. The strategy is cleaner in terms of American casualties. No ground combat, no kamikaze losses, but it extends the war indefinitely and guarantees massive Japanese civilian casualties from starvation and bombing. The moral calculus is explicit and horrifying. Invasion kills 500,000 Americans and several million Japanese, but ends the war by mid-1946. Blockade kills fewer Americans but more Japanese civilians, and might not force surrender for years. There's a third option that no one wants to articulate: accept Japanese conditional surrender. Japan has sent peace feelers through neutral countries, suggesting they'll surrender if the emperor is retained and war crimes trials are avoided. Some State Department officials argue this should be accepted. It ends the war immediately without invasion, but military leaders argue that conditional surrender rewards Japanese aggression and betrays Allied principles. Truman is inclined to agree. Unconditional surrender is the stated Allied policy. Accepting less would dishonor the sacrifices already made. Admiral Nimitz, speaking from Pearl Harbor via secure link, provides his personal assessment. His voice is quiet but firm. Mr. President, Japan is already defeated. The blockade has cut off their oil. The bombing is destroying their cities. Their navy is gone. Their air force is being ground down. Invasion may not be necessary. But if we decide invasion is necessary, my fleet will conduct the operation. We will take casualties, many of them, but we will succeed. Truman asks the question that's been haunting him. Admiral, what do you personally recommend? There's a long pause. Then Nimitz responds, I recommend we give them one more chance to surrender before making any irreversible decisions. The alternatives are all terrible, but an unnecessary invasion is the most terrible of all. The meeting adjourns without decision. Truman must weigh military necessity against political reality, American lives against Japanese lives, ending the war quickly against ending it morally. In the weeks following, he receives briefings on the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. The weapon has been successfully tested in New Mexico. 2 bombs will be ready for operational use by early August. The bombs represent the option that no one in the June 18th meeting wanted to discuss: end the war with a new weapon that kills hundreds of thousands but avoids invasion. The moral calculus doesn't improve, it just shifts. Instead of starving millions or sacrificing hundreds of thousands of Americans, America can kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese instantly with a weapon so terrible it forces surrender through shock. While Truman deliberates in Washington, preparations for Operation Olympic continue. In the Marianas, troops begin intensive training for the Kyushu landings. In Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's staff finalizes operational plans. Landing beaches are selected, bombardment schedules are prepared, and logistics chains are established. The Navy begins concentrating the largest fleet ever assembled, over 1,000 ships. The Pentagon orders the manufacture of 500,000 Purple Hearts, medals given to wounded service members, in anticipation of Operation Downfall casualties. These Purple Hearts will never be fully distributed. 80 years later, the military is still issuing Purple Hearts from the 1945 stock, a silent testament to casualties that never occurred. Admiral Nimitz makes a personal tour of units preparing for Olympic. He visits Marine divisions training in Hawaii. He visits Army divisions in the Philippines. He talks to junior officers and enlisted men about their expectations. What he hears troubles him deeply. The men know Kyushu will be worse than Okinawa. They've heard the casualty estimates. They've seen friends die. And they're going to do it anyway because that's their mission. The combination of courage and resignation breaks something in Nimitz. These men deserve better than to die in the last battles of a war that's already effectively won. But he can't tell them the invasion might not happen. He can't discuss the atomic bomb. He's only been vaguely briefed on its existence. He can only tell them what he's told every unit throughout the war. The mission ahead is difficult, but you are trained, you are equipped, and you are Americans. You will prevail. The words sound hollow even to him. July 16, 1945, New Mexico. The first atomic bomb is successfully tested at Trinity Site. The explosion is equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, more powerful than any weapon in history. The flash is visible for 100 miles. The mushroom cloud rises over 7 miles high. Physicists watching the test are awed and horrified. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Manhattan Project, later recalls thinking of a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." President Truman, attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, receives a coded message, "Babies satisfactorily born." The Manhattan Project has succeeded. The third option is now operational. Truman must decide whether to use it. July 26th. The Potsdam Declaration is issued. Japan must surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The declaration is deliberately vague about what utter destruction means. Japan's government debates the ultimatum. Hardliners argue that accepting unconditional surrender is worse than fighting to the end. Moderates argue that continued resistance is suicidal. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki publicly announces that Japan will ignore the declaration. It's not a clear rejection. The Japanese word used is mokusatsu, which can mean ignore, withhold comment, or reject. But American translators interpret it as rejection. Truman makes his decision. The atomic bombs will be used. On August 6th and August 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are destroyed. Japan surrenders on August 15th. Admiral Nimitz learns of the atomic bombings from press reports. He was not consulted about the decision or informed in advance about the timing. His initial reaction is relief mixed with moral ambiguity. The bombs ended the war without Operation Olympic. His sailors and Marines won't die on Kyushu's beaches, but the cost in Japanese civilian lives is staggering. In his private diary, he writes, "I do not know if the atomic bombs were necessary. I know that invasion would have been catastrophic. Perhaps there was no good choice, only less terrible ones." Publicly, he never criticizes the decision. When asked years later whether the bombs were justified, he responds carefully, "The bombs ended the war. Whether they were the only way to end the war is a question I cannot answer with certainty." The calculation of the incalculable, how many American lives justify how many Japanese lives, will be debated for generations. Historians will argue endlessly about whether Japan would have surrendered without the bombs, whether blockade alone would have worked, whether invasion was truly necessary. Nimitz refused to engage in those debates. His position remained consistent. Japan was already defeated by August 1945. Invasion would have cost catastrophic casualties, and any option that ended the war without invasion was preferable. The atomic bombs were one such option. Whether they were morally superior to invasion or blockade was not a question he felt qualified to answer. He was an admiral, not a moral philosopher. He calculated what could be calculated. Casualties, logistics, timing, the incalculable, the moral weight of different forms of mass death, he left to others. August 6th, 1945, 08:15 hours, Hiroshima, Japan. The B-29 bomber, Enola Gay, releases a single bomb from 31,000 feet. The bomb falls for 43 seconds. At 1,980 feet above the city, the bomb detonates with a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion creates a fireball with a core temperature exceeding 1 million degrees. Everything within a mile of ground zero is instantly vaporized. The thermal pulse ignites fires throughout the city. The blast wave destroys buildings 5 miles from the detonation point. A mushroom cloud rises over 50,000 feet. Within seconds, 70,000 people are dead. By the end of 1945, the death toll will reach 140,000. The age of nuclear warfare has begun, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Guam, learns about it from a radio news bulletin. He was not consulted about the decision to use the weapon. He was not informed about the timing. He picks up his phone and calls his operations officer. "Halt all offensive operations pending further orders. The war may be ending." The atomic bomb is the culmination of the Manhattan Project, a secret program that has cost $2 billion and employed over 130,000 people. Admiral Nimitz knew the project existed. He was briefed in vague terms in June, but he had no operational role in it. The decision to use atomic weapons was made by President Truman in consultation with Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project. The Navy's contribution was logistical. The heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis transported atomic bomb components from California to Tinian Island in the Marianas. The Indianapolis delivered its cargo on July 26th and was then torpedoed by a Japanese submarine 4 days later, sinking with heavy loss of life. 879 sailors died in the worst single-ship disaster in Navy history. They never knew what cargo they had carried. August 9th, Nagasaki, Japan. A second atomic bomb is dropped from the B-29 Bockscar. The bomb detonates over the Urakami Valley with a force of 21,000 tons. 70,000 people are killed. The second bomb is intended to demonstrate that America has multiple atomic weapons and will continue using them until Japan surrenders. In reality, America only has 2 operational bombs. If Japan doesn't surrender after Nagasaki, there will be a gap of weeks before more bombs are available. But Japan's leadership doesn't know this. They believe America has an unlimited supply and will methodically destroy every city in Japan. Combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on August 8th and invasion of Manchuria, Japan's strategic position is hopeless. The Japanese government's response to the bombs is not immediate surrender, but desperate internal debate. The military leadership wants to continue fighting despite the atomic attacks. They argue that the American bombing campaign has already destroyed dozens of cities through conventional means. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, killing hundreds of thousands. The atomic bombs are simply more efficient versions of what's already happening. Surrender remains unacceptable, but the civilian leadership recognizes that the atomic bombs combined with Soviet entry into the war have made continued resistance suicidal. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo advocate for accepting the Potsdam Declaration surrender terms. The government deadlocks, 3 ministers for surrender, 3 against. The decision must be made by Emperor Hirohito. August 10th, Emperor Hirohito convenes an imperial conference and makes an unprecedented decision. Japan will surrender. But there is one condition. The emperor's position must be preserved. The surrender message is transmitted through neutral Switzerland to allied governments. The Japanese government are ready to accept the terms enumerated in the joint declaration, which was issued at Potsdam on July 26th by the heads of the governments of the United States, Great Britain, and China, and later subscribed to by the Soviet government, with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand, which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. It's not unconditional surrender. It's conditional on retaining the emperor. The Allied response must determine whether this condition is acceptable. Admiral Nimitz receives the Japanese surrender offer at 0700 hours on August 10th. His immediate reaction is to recommend acceptance. In a message to Admiral King and the Joint Chiefs, he writes, "The Japanese offer should be accepted. The Emperor is the only authority who can order Japanese forces throughout the Pacific to lay down their arms. Without him, we face continued resistance from isolated garrisons that don't acknowledge the surrender. Preserving the emperor is militarily necessary." This position puts Nimitz at odds with some political leaders who want unconditional surrender without exceptions. But Nimitz's reasoning is strategic, not political. Ending the war cleanly requires Japanese institutional authority to remain functional. Washington debates the Japanese offer for 3 days. The terms are modified in the Allied response. The emperor can remain, but will be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers, who will oversee the occupation. It's a compromise that preserves the emperor's position while ensuring Allied control. The modified terms are sent to Japan on August 11th. Japan's government debates the Allied response. Hardline military officers attempt a coup to prevent surrender, storming the imperial palace to find the emperor's recorded surrender message and destroy it. The coup fails. On August 15th at noon, Tokyo time, Emperor Hirohito's voice is broadcast over radio for the first time in history. He announces Japan's acceptance of Allied surrender terms. The war is over. Admiral Nimitz receives word of the surrender at 0400 hours on August 15th, Guam time. He immediately issues orders to all forces: cease offensive operations, maintain defensive positions, prepare for occupation duties. The transition from war to peace must be managed carefully. Thousands of Allied prisoners of war are held in camps throughout Japan and occupied territories. Japanese forces scattered across the Pacific must be disarmed and repatriated. The occupation of Japan must be planned and executed without triggering resistance, and the fleet that has been fighting for 3 years and 8 months must transition from destruction to reconstruction. It's the most complex administrative challenge Nimitz has faced. The formal surrender ceremony is scheduled for September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The choice of Missouri is political. It's President Truman's home state. The choice of Tokyo Bay is strategic. It symbolizes American power projecting into the heart of Japan. General Douglas MacArthur will preside as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. Admiral Nimitz will sign for the United States. Representatives from Britain, China, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand will also sign. The ceremony is designed to be formal, dignified, and final. There will be no ambiguity about who won the war. September 2nd, 0900 hours, Tokyo Bay. USS Missouri is anchored with Mount Fuji visible in the distance. 358 Allied ships fill the bay. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers. The message is clear. This is the fleet that defeated Japan. Japanese representatives arrive aboard the destroyer USS Buchanan and are escorted to Missouri. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu represent Japan. They climb to the veranda deck where a simple table has been set with surrender documents. General MacArthur speaks briefly. "We are gathered here to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." The Japanese representatives sign at 0904. MacArthur signs for the Allied powers. Nimitz signs for the United States at 0908. Other Allied representatives follow. At 0923, the ceremony ends. The war is officially over. Admiral Nimitz watches the ceremony with mixed emotions. Relief that the killing has stopped. Grief for the thousands of sailors who died under his command. Satisfaction that his strategy succeeded. But also awareness that the peace must be managed as carefully as the war was fought. In his remarks to his staff after the ceremony, he says, "Unconditional surrender was achieved, but the manner of victory will determine the nature of peace. We defeated Japan. Now we must help Japan rebuild. The alternative, a humiliated, embittered nation seeking revenge, is unacceptable." It's a statement that reveals Nimitz's strategic thinking extends beyond military victory to political stability. The days following surrender are tense. American forces occupy Japan's major cities and military bases. Marines land at Yokosuka Naval Base and find it intact. The Japanese have obeyed surrender orders and not destroyed their facilities. Prisoners of war are liberated from camps throughout Japan and the Pacific. The stories they tell of torture, starvation, and death march as fuel calls for harsh occupation policies. But Nimitz and MacArthur agree that occupation must be firm, but not vindictive. Japanese civilians must see Americans as liberators from militarism, not as conquerors seeking revenge. The occupation must create conditions for democratic reform, not resentment. Admiral Nimitz makes a decision that shocks some of his subordinates. He orders American forces to treat Japanese civilians with respect. Looting is forbidden. Requisitioning of civilian property must be paid for. Japanese police maintain order under Allied supervision. When some officers protest that this is too lenient given Japanese war crimes, Nimitz responds coldly. "We won the war. Now we're winning the peace. Behave accordingly." The policy succeeds. Japanese civilians, expecting rape, pillage, and revenge, instead encounter an occupation force that is strict but fair. The contrast with their own military's behavior in occupied territories is stark. American occupation becomes acceptable, then eventually welcome. In the weeks following surrender, Admiral Nimitz tours Japan, visiting bases and installations. He meets with Japanese naval officers, some of whom he faced across battles. The conversations are formal, but not hostile. Japanese officers express professional respect for American naval capabilities. Nimitz reciprocates, acknowledging Japanese courage and tactical skill. These meetings establish a foundation for post-war military cooperation. Within a decade, Japan will be a U.S. ally. Within 2 decades, Japanese naval officers will train with their American counterparts. The transformation from enemies to partners begins in the careful diplomacy of the early occupation. But Nimitz also ensures accountability for war crimes. He testifies at war crimes trials when asked. He provides evidence of atrocities committed against Allied prisoners and civilians. He does not advocate for vindictive punishment, but he insists on justice. The balance between reconciliation and accountability is delicate. Nimitz navigates it by focusing on institutional reform rather than collective punishment. The Japanese military establishment that launched aggressive war must be dismantled. The individuals responsible for atrocities must be prosecuted. But the Japanese people must be given a path forward. 3 words ended the war. We accept unconditionally. But the manner of accepting those 3 words, with dignity on both sides, with justice but not revenge, with vision for a stable peace, determined what came after. And that was where Admiral Chester Nimitz proved that strategic thinking doesn't end when the shooting stops. Tokyo, Japan, September 15th, 1945. Admiral Chester Nimitz, dressed in his white service uniform, is escorted through the Imperial Palace to meet Emperor Hirohito. The meeting was not ordered by higher authority. It was requested by Nimitz himself. Many of his officers consider it unnecessary, even inappropriate. Why should the victorious admiral meet the defeated emperor? But Nimitz understands something that eludes many. The war ended because Emperor Hirohito ordered it to end. If Japanese forces throughout the Pacific are to comply with surrender orders, the emperor's authority must be preserved. And if America wants a stable occupation rather than guerrilla warfare, the emperor must be treated with respect. The meeting lasts 30 minutes. No record is kept of the conversation. But witnesses report that both men behave with formal dignity. Nimitz bows slightly on entering, not a gesture of subordination, but of respect. Hirohito thanks Nimitz for the Navy's humane treatment of Japanese prisoners. Nimitz responds that both nations must now work to ensure that such a war never happens again. When Nimitz leaves, he tells his aide, "That was the most important meeting of my career." The decision to preserve Emperor Hirohito is controversial in America and among Allied nations. Many want him tried as a war criminal. The argument is straightforward. The emperor presided over a regime that started the war, committed atrocities across Asia, and caused millions of deaths. How can he escape accountability? But General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz both recommend against trying the emperor. Their reasoning is strategic. The emperor is the only authority who can ensure compliance with surrender throughout Japan and its far-flung garrisons. Execute or imprison the emperor, and the occupation faces potential chaos. Religious fanaticism could trigger resistance. Military units might refuse to surrender. MacArthur famously states that occupying Japan without the emperor would require 1 million troops. With the emperor's cooperation, it requires 300,000. President Truman accepts the recommendation. The emperor remains but under Allied authority. Nimitz later writes, "Revenge is satisfying, but peace is more important." December 1945. Washington, D.C. Admiral Nimitz is promoted to Fleet Admiral, 5 stars, the Navy's highest rank. Only 4 men have held this rank: Ernest King, William Leahy, Chester Nimitz, and William Halsey. The promotion ceremony is held at the White House with President Truman presiding. Yes, Truman's speech praises Nimitz's strategic brilliance, operational excellence, and humanity in victory. But Nimitz's acceptance speech focuses not on victories, but on those who didn't survive to see them. He reads a letter from a sailor who died at Okinawa, addressed to his parents. "I don't know if we'll win, but I know we're fighting for something that matters." Nimitz pauses, visibly emotional, then concludes, "We won because men like him believed we should. The victory is theirs. I merely had the honor of commanding them." The speech is reprinted in newspapers nationwide. The admiral who never sought glory becomes the war's most honored naval commander, not because he claimed credit, but because he deflected it. 1946 through 1947. Admiral Nimitz serves as Chief of Naval Operations, the Navy's senior uniformed officer. His tenure focuses on demobilization and reorganization. The Navy that won the Pacific War consisted of over 3 million personnel and 6,700 ships. Peacetime requires dramatic reduction, but Nimitz fights to preserve critical capabilities: carrier aviation, submarine forces, amphibious capability, and naval intelligence. He argues that the next war, if there is one, will require the same capabilities that won the last war. He's proven right within 5 years when the Korean War begins. The Navy's ability to respond rapidly to Korea is due to Nimitz's refusal to completely demobilize after World War II. But Nimitz's most important post-war contribution is his advocacy for former enemies. When Japanese-American students who were interned during the war apply to universities, many face discrimination. Nimitz publicly endorses their applications to the University of California, where he serves as regent. When Japanese naval officers who fought at Midway and Philippine Sea apply for positions in Japan's post-war self-defense forces, Nimitz writes recommendations. His logic is consistent. The war was between nations and ideologies, not between individuals. Former enemies who embrace democracy deserve support, not continued punishment. Some criticize him as too forgiving. Nimitz responds, "I fought to defeat Japan, not to destroy the Japanese people. There's a difference." 1952, Berkeley, California. Nimitz retires from public service and moves to quarters on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay. He spends his retirement reading, corresponding with former subordinates, and writing. His memoirs are characteristically modest, focusing on the contributions of others rather than his own decisions. When historians interview him for oral history projects, he consistently deflects personal credit. "The Pacific War was won by millions of people doing their jobs," he says. "I simply had the privilege of coordinating their efforts." This modesty frustrates historians who want detailed accounts of critical decisions, but it reveals Nimitz's fundamental character. He genuinely believes leadership is about enabling others, not personal glory. Throughout the 1950s, Nimitz maintains correspondence with Japanese naval officers he once fought. Admiral Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, converts to Christianity and becomes an evangelist. He writes to Nimitz seeking reconciliation. Nimitz responds, "The past cannot be changed, but we can build a different future. I bear you no malice." The letter is published in Japanese newspapers and contributes to reconciliation between former enemies. Other Japanese officers visit Nimitz in California. Conversations focus not on relitigating battles, but on lessons learned and paths forward. By the late 1950s, Japan and the United States are formal allies. The transformation from mortal enemies to partners happens in a single generation. Nimitz's personal diplomacy helps make that transformation possible. 1963, San Francisco Bay. The U.S. Navy commissions USS Nimitz, CVN 68, the first of a new class of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Chester Nimitz attends the christening ceremony. The carrier displaces 97,000 tons, 3 times larger than Enterprise, his flagship carrier during the war. It can operate 100 aircraft and sustain operations indefinitely without refueling. Its nuclear reactors represent technology unimaginable in 1941. Nimitz tours the carrier and marvels at the advances, but he tells the crew, "The technology has changed, the ships have changed, but the principles haven't. Take care of your people, complete your mission, come home safely. Those are the only things that matter." The carrier USS Nimitz will serve for over 50 years, participating in every major American naval operation, from the Cold War through the Gulf Wars. It becomes the most famous ship in the Navy, carrying the name of the Admiral who rebuilt the Pacific Fleet from the ashes of Pearl Harbor. February 20th, 1966. Nimitz dies at his home on Yerba Buena Island. He's 80 years old. His funeral is held on the island with full military honors. Representatives from Japan attend, including retired Japanese naval officers who fought against him. The eulogies emphasize not his victories, but his character, humility, mercy, strategic vision, and dedication to those who served under him. President Lyndon Johnson issues a statement. "Admiral Nimitz won the Pacific War, but his greatest victory was the peace that followed." Admiral Arleigh Burke, chief of naval operations, speaks at the funeral. "We will not see his like again. He was the complete naval officer, strategist, diplomat, leader, and above all, a man of honor." Nimitz is buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. His gravestone is simple, identical to every other military gravestone in the cemetery. It lists his name, rank, dates of birth and death, and nothing else. No mention of Pearl Harbor, Midway, or the Pacific Fleet. No list of campaigns or decorations, just Chester W. Nimitz, Fleet Admiral, United States Navy. The simplicity is deliberate, specified in his will. He didn't want special recognition beyond what any service member receives. Even in death, he deflects glory. The legacy of Chester Nimitz extends far beyond his military victories. He demonstrated that strategic excellence includes moral clarity. Defeat the enemy, but don't dehumanize them. He proved that leadership is about enabling others, not dominating them. He showed that mercy after victory is not weakness, but wisdom. The Pacific War could have ended with a vengeful occupation that created decades of resentment. Instead, it ended with an occupation that transformed Japan from enemy to ally. Nimitz's role in that transformation is often overlooked because it lacked drama. There were no great battles in the post-war period, no dramatic decisions, just patient, careful management of victory's aftermath. But that management created a stable Pacific that has lasted nearly 80 years. In 1941, Chester Nimitz was an admiral who couldn't get into West Point, who ran his first ship aground, who spent years in unglamorous staff positions. He was nobody's first choice to command the Pacific Fleet. 28 admirals were senior to him. But Admiral Ernest King and President Franklin Roosevelt saw qualities that transcended rank: judgment, humility, resilience, and vision. They gambled on an obscure rear admiral to rebuild a shattered fleet and win a war across 5,000 miles of ocean. The gamble succeeded because Nimitz understood something that many brilliant officers never learn. Leadership is not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about surrounding yourself with smart people and getting out of their way. It's about learning from failure without being destroyed by it. It's about mission over glory, substance over style, results over recognition. The young ensign who accepted a letter of reprimand for grounding his ship in 1907 learned that mercy matters more than punishment. The submarine officer who volunteered for a dangerous, unglamorous service learned that unconventional thinking wins wars. The staff officer who spent years in Washington learned that knowing your people is as important as knowing your enemy. And the fleet admiral who met Emperor Hirohito in September 1945 learned that winning the war is not enough. You must win the peace. Every lesson built on the previous one. Every failure taught something essential. By December 1941, when the call came to take command of the Pacific Fleet, Chester Nimitz had been preparing his entire career without realizing it. The war he fought was brutal, costly, and ultimately victorious. Over 100,000 American military personnel died in the Pacific theater under his command. Hundreds of ships were sunk, thousands of aircraft were lost. But the strategic decisions he made, trusting intelligence, protecting aggressive commanders, balancing risk and caution, systematically learning from mistakes, saved countless additional lives. His greatest victory was not Midway or Leyte Gulf, or the carrier battles that destroyed Japanese naval aviation. His greatest victory was building a peace that lasted. The admiral who built that peace never sought recognition for it. He simply did his duty, as he had done since he was 15 years old, in a Texas town 300 miles from the ocean. And in doing his duty with humility, wisdom, and humanity, Chester Nimitz became the kind of leader that history celebrates but rarely produces. A warrior who understood that the ultimate purpose of war is peace.